Section 1. The Wasteland Awakens. There is something that happens to you the first time you step out of a vault. The door grinds open with a sound like a mountain clearing its throat, and the light hits you all at once pale, unfiltered, the kind of light that hasn't been softened by glass or filtered through recycled air in 200 years. You walk forward, and the world just stretches out ahead of you, cracked earth. Dead trees with their arms frozen in shapes they made the moment the heat wave passed through. Buildings in the distance, punched through with holes, listing to the side like old men who gave up on standing straight decades ago. And the sky wide and enormous and completely indifferent to everything that happened beneath it. That feeling, that specific cocktail of dread and wonder and quiet longing, is the thing that has kept people playing Fallout games for almost 30 years now. There's something about the world Bethesda and the original Black Isle Studios built that doesn't behave like other game worlds. Other game worlds feel designed. Fallout's world feels like it was once real, and someone broke it, and nobody cleaned it up. And hiding inside that broken world, tucked into corners that most players never visit, written onto terminals nobody reads, sitting in audio logs that play to empty rooms, there are hundreds of mysteries. Some of them have answers, if you know where to look. Some of them probably have answers that the developers knew and just never shared. And some of them are the kind that feel like they were designed to never be resolved, like notes left in a house that burned down, addressed to someone who stopped answering the door. This video is going to take you through 300 of them. We're going slow tonight. Relaxed. The idea is to move through this like you're actually wandering the wasteland yourself late in the day, the light going orange, no particular destination in mind, just following your curiosity down whatever path opens up. Some of these mysteries are enormous, world-shaking questions about who started the war that ended civilization. Some of them are tiny and strange, the story of one skeleton in one room that nobody can fully explain. All of them are real. All of them came from somewhere inside these games. And all of them, when you sit with them long enough, have that quality that Fallout does better than almost any other franchise in the history of gaming. The feeling that the world goes on existing, whether you're watching it or not, that there are stories happening in rooms you never entered, that there are answers to questions you haven't thought to ask yet, sitting quietly in the static behind the radio signal. So settle in. Get comfortable. The wasteland isn't going anywhere. The Fallout franchise began in 1997, built by a small team at Interplay Entertainment under the creative direction of Tim Kaine, Leonard Boyarsky, and a handful of others who had grown up reading science fiction paperbacks from the 1950s, watching post-apocalyptic films in their teens, and obsessing over tabletop role-playing games that let you build any world you wanted. The original game wasn't supposed to use Fallout's own system at all. It was built around the GURPS rules, the generic universal role-playing system developed by Steve Jackson Games. The deal fell through because Jackson objected to the game's graphic violence. So, Tim Kaine and his team invented the special system in roughly 6 weeks, and in doing so created one of the most enduring RPG frameworks in the medium's history. That's mystery number one. Of sorts, what would Fallout have been if it had kept the GURPS license? A slightly different game, probably. Maybe less distinctly its own thing? We'll never know. The world Kaine and his team designed was deliberately ambiguous about certain things. The original Fallout game never fully explained who launched the first nuclear missiles, for instance. That was an intentional choice. Kaine has talked about this publicly, noting that the point wasn't the cause but the consequence. The world ended. Everything you care about in the game is what happened after. The question of blame was meant to feel irrelevant, which is its own kind of statement about nuclear war. But decades of subsequent games, novels, add-ons, and finally a television series have kept circling back to that question anyway, adding pieces to a picture that still hasn't fully resolved itself, even now, in 2025 and beyond. That tension between questions that have answers and questions that don't is at the heart of why Fallout generates so many mysteries in the first place. The franchise is built on deliberate gaps, on terminals that cut off mid-sentence, on audio logs that run out of tape before the story finishes, on rooms where something clearly happened and the evidence is scattered in a way that forces you to reconstruct it yourself. The games trust you to do that reconstruction work. They trust that you're curious enough and patient enough to follow the thread. And people have. For nearly 3 decades, players have been digging into these games with the energy of dedicated archaeologists, pulling up details that the surface never hints at. They've found cut content buried in game files that tells alternate versions of familiar stories. They've read every terminal entry in every building, assembled the logs in the right order, noticed the detail that doesn't quite add up. They've built entire theories from a few lines of NPC dialogue and a screenshot of a texture that appears in the background of a room you weren't supposed to notice. Fallout's world is dense enough and strange enough and old enough now that you could spend a lifetime exploring it and still turn up new things. This video will only scratch the surface. But what a surface it is. Let's begin where the world began. Not in October of 2077 when the bombs fell, but earlier than that, in the corporate boardrooms and government bunkers where the decisions were made that guaranteed the world would end exactly the way it did. One of the things Fallout does brilliantly, and that players sometimes overlook in favor of the Wasteland adventures, is its pre-war world. The society that existed before the Great War wasn't our society. It was a version of America frozen somewhere around 1950 in terms of its aesthetic and cultural sensibility. But with technology that had leapfrogged decades ahead in some directions, nuclear power, personal robotics, advanced genetics research while staying completely stagnant in others. There was no internet, no digital communication as we understand it. Information traveled by radio, by paper, by physical media, and at the center of that pre-war society, operating with essentially unchecked power and money, was Vault-Tec Corporation. And Vault-Tec is where so many of the deepest mysteries in this franchise live. Before we go deeper, pause for a second and drop a comment down below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. There's something genuinely wonderful about knowing that people in completely different parts of the world are settling in with the same mysteries. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the subscribe button is right there. It genuinely helps. And every notification means one more person gets a new Wasteland story delivered to them. Section 2. The Great War Who Really Pressed the Button. The 23rd of October 2077. That date sits at the center of the entire Fallout universe, like a stone at the bottom of a still pond. Everything in the games radiates outward from it. Every ghoul walking through a collapsed shopping mall was a person going about their morning on the 23rd of October 2077. Every skeleton sitting in a chair in a kitchen that still has breakfast dishes on the table was a person who went to sleep on October 22nd. Every rusted car on every road was in motion or parked or being repaired on that day. And at 9:13 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System picked up the first wave of incoming nuclear missiles. And the world had, at that point, about 2 hours left in anything resembling its previous form. The question of who actually launched those missiles has been one of the franchise's most enduring arguments. The games themselves are deliberately evasive about it. The original Fallout never specified. Fallout 2 gave you a conversation with President Dick Richardson of the Enclave. Yes, that is genuinely his name. And no, the game is not being subtle about what it thinks of pre-war American political leadership, who indicated that China had launched a preemptive strike. Fallout 4's switchboard terminal entries, found in the old Defense Intelligence Agency facility, trace a chain of events that points toward Chinese aircraft being the first to fire. And Tim Kaine himself said in a 2023 interview that China launched first, driven by the revelation that America had been conducting illegal bioweapon research using the forced evolutionary virus. The FEV project, which would eventually give the world supermutants, was supposed to be a medical breakthrough, a cure for all human disease. It became something else entirely. China found out, demanded it stop, and when America publicly agreed and privately just moved the program, the situation collapsed. That's the version many longtime fans have carried as the answer for years. China's back was against the wall, American deception was the trigger, and the missiles flew. But then came the television series, the Amazon Prime Fallout show, which premiered in 2024 and is fully canonical to the franchise, according to Bethesda's Todd Howard, introduced a scene that changed the conversation entirely. In a flashback to 2077, Vault-Tec executive Barb Howard, the wife of the man who would eventually become the ghoul Cooper Howard, sits in a conference room with representatives from multiple pre-war megacorporations, Robco, West-Tec, Big MT, Repcon. And at the table, Vault-Tec makes a proposal. Why wait for someone else to end the world when Vault-Tec could be the one to do it? The vaults are built, the experiments are ready. The only thing missing is the war. And if someone else fired first, Vault-Tec's entire investment, the vaults, the research subjects, the generations of experiment data might be wasted. Better to be the cause than the consequence. The scene is presented as a suggestion, not a confirmed action. Barb puts the idea on the table. The meeting ends without resolution. The show's first season doesn't confirm whether Vault-Tec actually pushed the button. Season 2 complicated the picture further, Mr. House, one of the most calculating minds in the entire franchise, explicitly dismisses the idea that Vault-Tec would have been capable of actually firing first, while acknowledging that individual employees like Barb could still have played a role. He points to an even stranger element. Whoever created the Death Claws, he believes, is the person who started the war. And that answer, the Deathclaw origin being connected to whoever fired the first nuke, is a loose thread that Season 2 leaves deliberately untied. So where does that leave us? The honest answer is that we have layers of competing evidence pointing in multiple directions, and the franchise seems to have made a deliberate choice to keep it that way. Tim Kane's statement points to China. The game's internal evidence points to China. But the TV show, which is canon, introduces Vault-Tec as a credible alternative. And beneath both of those is the Enclave, the shadow remnant of the American government that had spent decades preparing for a post-war world they could control. The Enclave had every reason to want the war to happen, and had positioned themselves to survive it. Season 2 reveals they were manipulating Vault-Tec's plans, threatening key executives into certain behaviors. Whether they engineered the war directly or simply exploited a situation that was already heading there regardless is, as of the most recent canonical material, still unresolved. Here is mystery number 2. One of the loading screen texts in Fallout games mentions, almost in passing, the theory that alien visitors may have had something to do with the war. It's presented as a fringe idea that most sensible wastelanders dismiss. But Fallout has a genuine alien presence running through it, from the crashed UFO in Fallout 3 to the entire Mothership Zeta DLC to various scattered wreckage across multiple games. The Zetans, as the aliens are called, have been observing Earth for a long time. The loading screen hint is likely the developers having fun rather than a serious lore suggestion, but in a franchise that has Lovecraftian horrors living under marble quarries, you can't entirely rule anything out. Mystery 3. The exact minute the war ended. It began and ended on the same day, the 23rd of October 2077. The entire nuclear exchange, every missile, every warhead, every city reduced to ash happened within hours. That's always been presented as a fact in Fallout lore, but it raises a question that nobody in the games fully addresses. Who was actually awake and making decisions in those final hours? The American president and cabinet were already en route to or inside the Enclave's oil rig bunker. The military chain of command was fractured. At some point in those hours, the automated systems took over nuclear launch protocols that didn't need a human finger on the button anymore. Mystery 3 is the question of how much of the war was actually fought by people, and how much was fought by machines following contingency plans that nobody had the authority to countermand anymore. Mystery 4. What happened in China after the bombs fell? This one is genuinely unknown. The Fallout games have never depicted China's post-war state. We know the Chinese mainland was hit by American retaliatory strikes. We know that Chinese military assets in the United States, soldiers and spies who had been operating on American soil, continued following their last orders for decades after the war because they had no way of knowing the homeland was gone. There's a group of them in Fallout 3, in the basement of a food processing facility in Washington, D.C., still convinced they're fighting. Another group eventually made their way to San Francisco and integrated into wasteland society, becoming a faction called the Shi. But what happened to China itself? Was anyone left? Did they rebuild? The show seems to be gesturing toward eventually exploring non-American settings, but as of now, the fate of one of the war's primary combatants remains entirely unknown. Mystery 5. The exact nature of the resource crisis that preceded the war. The games tell us that oil ran out, that the world was spiraling into conflict over dwindling petroleum reserves, that the resource wars preceded the Great War by decades, with various nations fighting over what was left. But the Fallout world's technology level is a strange mixture. Cars run on fusion cells in some cases, on gasoline in others. The infrastructure makes no consistent sense if oil genuinely ran out. The theory that makes the most sense to many community members is that the oil crisis was more geopolitical than literal, that reserves existed but were controlled by rival powers, and the war was over access rather than actual depletion. But the games leave that ambiguous enough that it's never fully certain. Mystery 6. The Forced Evolutionary Virus and its Original Purpose. The FEV started as a project at Vault-Tec, which means the same corporation that developed power armor technology for the military was also working on what would become the single most transformative biological agent in Fallout's history. The virus was initially framed as a potential cure for disease, a way to make the human body radically more resilient. The military got involved because a radically more resilient human body would also be a more effective soldier. Things escalated from there. But here's the thing. The FEV works very differently on different people. In some, it creates super mutants, enormous and strong but cognitively degraded. In others, it creates different mutations entirely. The variability of FEV's effects has never been fully explained in-game. Why does it work so differently? Is it responding to something in the individual, or in the environment, or in how it was administered? That inconsistency is one of the franchise's quiet biological mysteries. Mystery 7. The Master's Plan in the original Fallout. The Master, one of gaming's great villains, a being who had fused himself with a computer system and accumulated other minds into a horrifying Gestalt consciousness, believed he was saving humanity. His project was to convert all of humanity into super mutants, which he believed were the next step in human evolution. The logical problem with his plan, which the player can actually confront him with during the game's climax, is that super mutants are sterile. His vision of the future was biological dead end. When you prove this to him with either science or persuasion, he accepts the truth and removes himself from the equation. But the mystery that persists is this. How did he not know? He was brilliant. He had access to enormous scientific resources. The sterility of super mutants was a documented fact in the research he had access to. Was he so convinced of his own vision that he refused to examine the data? Was there something about the FEV that he believed would eventually solve the problem? The game leaves it slightly ambiguous, and it's one of those character mysteries that gets more interesting the longer you sit with it. Mystery 8. Who built the vaults? Really? On the surface, Vault-Tec built the vaults. But Vault-Tec was a contractor, meaning there was a client, the United States government, specifically elements within it that would eventually become the Enclave. The vault's experiment designs seem to have been developed at multiple levels, some by Vault-Tec scientists, some by government agencies, some possibly by outside contractors who were never publicly identified. The TV show revealed that representatives from multiple corporations sat in on the planning discussions. Vault-Tec, Big MT, Robco, Repcon, all of these entities had a stake in what the vaults would do. That raises a question that the games have never answered. Which vaults were designed by whom? Were some of the more extreme experiments the work of government agencies rather than Vault-Tec itself? The attribution matters for understanding the full picture of how deliberately the pre-war world set up the post-war one. Mystery 9. The precise number of vaults that were actually built. The lore states that 122 vaults were constructed across the United States. That's a lot of vaults, and the games have only shown us a small fraction of them. The ones we've visited tend to cluster along the coasts and the American Southwest, which raises an obvious question. What's in the middle of the country? What vaults exist in the American Midwest, the Great Plains, the Deep South? Some fans have mapped out where the unrevealed vaults might be based on population distribution and geography, and the conclusions are that dozens of vaults are sitting in unexplored territory, their experiments having run their course or still ongoing in complete isolation. Every one of those hypothetical vaults is a mystery box, a potential story that has never been told. Mystery 10. The Vault-Tec vaults that the TV show hinted at but hasn't fully explored yet. Vault 24 was originally a New Vegas-era concept that only existed as a jumpsuit accessible through console commands. It finally appeared in the TV show as a facility that brainwashed American citizens into communist sympathizers, an almost satirically dark commentary on Cold War fear and McCarthyism. But the show only showed fragments of it. What was Vault 24's experiment ultimately trying to achieve? Was it testing whether ideological transformation was possible through behavioral conditioning? Was it trying to create sleeper agents? The pieces visible in the show suggest something far more elaborate than a simple conversion facility. Let's keep moving, because we're only getting started. Section 3. The Vault-Tec files experiments that shouldn't exist. The real horror of Vault-Tec isn't the bombs. It isn't even that they may have caused the war. The real horror is what they did to the people they were supposed to be saving. Take a moment with that concept. Vault-Tec marketed itself as the savior of humanity. They sold vault spots to people who were terrified of nuclear war, who genuinely believed that crawling underground was the only way to give their children a future. Families paid enormous sums. Couples spent their savings. People bought spots for elderly parents who would never have survived on the surface. They put their trust, completely and sincerely, in a corporation that was looking at them not as human beings, but as experimental subjects. And from the moment those blast doors sealed shut, the experiments began. Most of them weren't designed to help humanity survive. They were designed to generate data. Mystery 11, Vault 11 Sacrifice Mechanism. This is one of the most elaborately dark vault designs in the entire franchise, found in Fallout New Vegas. The vault's residents were told that one person among their number must be sacrificed each year. If they refused, the entire vault population would be killed. No further explanation was given. No information about who was making the demand or why. The vault dwellers responded by building an entire political culture around the selection process, forming parties, running campaigns, creating ideologies about who deserved to be sacrificed and who didn't. Over generations, this political system became increasingly violent, eventually erupting into civil war. A small group of 5 survivors eventually decided to refuse the sacrifice, accepting collective death rather than continue the cycle. And then something unexpected happened. The automated system rewarded them. It had apparently been waiting the entire time for the vault to refuse the sacrifice. The reward was that the automated maintenance robots would activate and serve the remaining survivors. But by that point, there was almost nobody left to benefit. The room where the rewarded survivors ended up contains holotapes of their final moments, and they're genuinely heartbreaking in a way that good fiction rarely manages. The question that lingers after Vault 11 is who designed this experiment and what they actually hoped to learn. Was it studying political systems under extreme pressure? Was it studying the threshold at which a community chooses self-annihilation over moral compromise? The experiment documentation doesn't specify. That silence feels deliberate. Mystery 12. Vault 22's Green Horror. Plants grew inside Vault 22, an experiment designed to see whether a vault could achieve food self-sufficiency through intensive agriculture. The science was legitimate, the goal was reasonable, and for a while it worked. But the fungi that developed in the vault's lower levels turned out to carry a spore that could infect living organisms and control their behavior, essentially turning hosts into vehicles for spore dispersal. The scientists noted what was happening. Their terminal entries traced the growing awareness that something was wrong. And then the entries stop, replaced by a silence that you explore when you enter the vault in New Vegas and find it overgrown with plant matter, its floors carpeted in spores, its residents long dead and still walking. Mystery 12 is the question of whether the fungal infection was an accident or whether someone knew it was in the spores from the beginning and allowed the experiment to proceed anyway. A few terminal entries suggest that late-stage researchers had theories about the spores that they were not supposed to share. The entries were flagged for deletion. Some of them survived. Mystery 13. Vault 21's Gambling Arrangement. The setup was elegant in a dark way. Any dispute among vault residents would be settled by gambling. The person who won the wager got what they wanted. That sounds almost whimsical until you follow the logic to its conclusion. What happens when someone gambles for something that can't be won back? In New Vegas, you find that one man, named Robert House, beat everyone who ever challenged him in the vault's casino. He won so comprehensively that he eventually just owned everything and everyone in the vault. He sealed the lower levels and turned the vault into a personal storage space. And in the present day of the game, he wants it back, but his motivations aren't entirely clear. Is it nostalgia? Is it the network of tunnels beneath it that connects to other infrastructure? Is there something specific in those sealed lower levels that he never retrieved? The game presents multiple possible answers and commits to none of them. Mystery 14. Vault 92 and the White Noise Experiments. The vault was populated entirely by musicians, an experiment in psychological manipulation through sound. White noise was pumped through the ventilation system at specific frequencies designed to trigger violent behavior in the residents. The official story is that this was studying the effects of audio stimulation on human psychology. But the unofficial story, pieced together from terminal entries, is that the overseer himself didn't know the full extent of what was happening. He noticed that residents were becoming erratic, violent. He tried to investigate. His own behavior started changing. The vault descended into massacre, and the audio logs documenting the final days are some of the most disturbing environmental storytelling in Fallout 3. Mystery 14 is who was monitoring the experiment from outside. Someone had to be watching the results. Someone had to be collecting the data. That person, or those people, is never identified in the game. Mystery 15, Vault 87's FEV chambers. The vault was designed specifically to expose its residents to an airborne form of the forced evolutionary virus, creating the capital wasteland's super mutants. This wasn't an accidental exposure. It was intentional from the start. But here's what makes it a mystery. The FEV strain used in Vault 87 produces super mutants that are different from those in other parts of the country. They're more aggressive, less intelligent, and their mutation process seems to be faster. The explanation given in passing is that the Vault 87 strain was a different variant, but nobody explains why multiple different variants of FEV existed, who developed them independently, or what the strategic purpose of having multiple super mutant creation methods in different geographic locations was supposed to serve. Was the government testing different FEV strains simultaneously across multiple vaults to compare results? That possibility is never directly confirmed. Mystery 16, Vault 106 and the drug in the air. 10 days after the vault sealed, psychoactive substances were pumped into the air filtration system. The overseer knew. Security personnel were told to observe the effects. 200 years later, when the lone wanderer enters the vault, the residents are still alive and still insane, still being dosed by systems that never received a shutdown signal. And the player character hallucinates when they get deep enough inside, which suggests the substance is still active in the air. What was in Vault 106's air supply? The game implies it was a powerful drug, but never specifies it. More disturbingly, what was the point? What data was worth making an entire vault population permanently psychotic? Mystery 17, Vault 108, and Gary. This one is almost funny if you look at it quickly enough, and deeply unsettling if you look at it for more than a second. Vault 108 was equipped with an unusual number of cloning technologies. Among the subjects used for cloning experiments was a man named Gary. The clones, dozens of them, all named Gary, all identical, all apparently sharing Gary's aggression and hostility, eventually killed everyone else in the vault and now occupy it entirely. The original Gary's vault number badge, Gary 23, can be found among the dead. The mystery isn't just why Vault-Tec thought cloning a vault resident was a useful experiment. It's what they were hoping to learn from the Gary clones specifically. Was Gary selected randomly? Was there something in his genetic profile that made him the ideal test subject? The game presents no explanation, just the aftermath, a vault full of identical, violent men who respond to everything with Gary. Mystery 18, Vault 112, and Dr. Braun's Paradise. This vault hides one of the most technically complex and morally disturbing experiments in the franchise. The residents were placed in suspended animation and connected to a virtual reality simulator, a permanent dream world controlled by Dr. Stanislaus Braun, the vault's overseer. Braun had promised them a perfect life. What he gave them was something considerably less comfortable. He had them play out scenarios of his choosing, often torturous ones. He would reset the simulation, erase memories, and start again. For 200 years, the residents had no idea how much time had passed. Some of them had been through thousands of iterations without knowing it. The mystery of Vault 112 isn't the cruelty itself that's horrifying but documented. The mystery is why Braun did it. He had absolute power over the simulation. He could have made it genuinely pleasant. Instead, he chose suffering. Was this a scientific experiment in psychological endurance? Was it personal sadism? Was he testing something about the limits of human experience? His own terminal entries suggest he was bored that genuine cruelty was more interesting to him than constructed happiness. That answer is somehow worse than anything more complicated would have been. Mystery 19. Vault 75 underneath Malden, Massachusetts. The vault was presented to the public as a standard shelter, but its true purpose was genetic experimentation on children. Children were accepted into the vault. Their parents were not. The children who showed genetic potential were advanced through the program. Those who didn't were killed. This continued for generations, with the vault effectively becoming a breeding program for enhanced human specimens. The overseer was fully complicit. By the time Fallout 4 takes place, the vault has been abandoned for decades, but the equipment, the testing chambers, and the documentation of what happened there are all still present. Mystery 19 is the question of what the enhanced specimens were ultimately intended for. The program continued for decades, producing generation after generation of genetically selected individuals. Were they ever deployed anywhere? Did they escape the vault before it was abandoned? Are there descendants of Vault 75's program walking the Commonwealth? Mystery 20. Vault 81's medical research? That wasn't. Vault 81 has one of the more interesting setups in Fallout 4. It's one of the few vaults you encounter that is still occupied and more or less functional. The residents are mostly normal. The vibe is, by Fallout standards, almost warm, but the vault was designed to be anything but warm. Its original purpose was to inject residents with various diseases and experimental cures, using the population as living test subjects to develop treatments for every human illness. The experiment was never fully implemented because the lead scientist, a man who apparently still had some conscience left, redirected the robots in charge of the injection protocols to test the diseases on himself instead. He died alone in a sealed research wing, taking the experiment's original purpose with him. The residents have no idea any of this happened. They think they live in an ordinary vault. Mystery 20 is how many other vaults have histories like this, where one person's last-minute choice changed what the experiment actually became, and the residents have been living with the consequences without understanding them. Mystery 21, the very first vault in the franchise, Vault 13, and the question of what its overseer actually knew. The original Fallout begins with the vault's water chip breaking down. The player is sent out into the wasteland to find a replacement. Simple enough. But the overseer sends only one person, with limited resources and minimal support, into a world that has been radioactive and hostile for over a century. The lore explanation is that the overseer's job was to keep the vault sealed, to never let anyone leave if he could help it. But was he following Vault-Tec instructions that the vault should never open, as with Vault 101 in Fallout 3? Or was he making a judgment call? And if he knew the vault was supposed to be sealed permanently, why did he ever send anyone out at all? The water chip was a practical necessity, but the overseer could have made other choices. The ambiguity of his motivations, bureaucratic compliance versus desperate pragmatism versus something more quietly haunts the beginning of the entire franchise. Mystery 22, Vault 95's Chem Dispenser. The vault's experiment was almost poetic in its cruelty. The vault was populated with people who had serious drug addiction problems, trying to recover. The vault provided therapy, community support, all the structures needed for long-term sobriety. 5 years in, when the residents had achieved genuine recovery and rebuilt their lives, Vault-Tec remotely activated a hidden chem dispenser that had been installed throughout the vault from the beginning. It flooded the environment with chems, instantly relapsing the entire population. The vault descended into chaos. Mystery 22 is whether this was studying relapse psychology specifically, or whether it was simply designed to demonstrate that any progress a human being makes can be undone from outside. Both interpretations are uncomfortable. Mystery 23, the Control Vaults. Among the 122 vaults, approximately 17 were designated as Control Vaults facilities that were supposed to actually work as advertised, with no hidden experiments, functioning as genuine shelters. The idea was that having some percentage of vaults operating normally gave the researchers comparison data for their experiment vaults. But some community members have pointed out that Control Vault might itself be a misleading designation, that a vault where people believe they're safe but are still being observed is itself a kind of experiment. One about what happens to human communities when they genuinely think everything is fine. None of the Control Vault residents would have consented to being in a study. They're just living their lives under long-term observation they never agreed to. In a franchise full of overt horror, that one is a quiet horror that sneaks up on you. Let me pause there and breathe for a moment, because the Vault-Tec rabbit hole is genuinely deep enough to fill this entire video. We'll come back to specific vaults as we move through other parts of the franchise. For now, let's follow a thread that goes somewhere stranger and darker into the occult history that runs beneath the surface of Fallout's world like a river of cold water. Section 4. The Dunwich Horror and Fallout's Eldritch Underbelly. In the southwestern corner of Fallout 3's capital wasteland, far from any major settlement, sitting alone on a stretch of blasted ground with no road leading to it, there is a building. It's called the Dunwich Building. The name is a reference to H.P. Lovecraft, specifically to his 1929 story, The Dunwich Horror, which concerns a remote Massachusetts town where something old and hungry has been awakened by people who should have known better than to. Look, that reference is not accidental. Nothing in the Dunwich Building is accidental. It is possibly the most carefully designed location in Fallout 3, a place where every detail has been placed to create a specific kind of dread that is different from the ordinary post-apocalyptic horror that fills the rest of the game. Mystery 24. What the Dunwich Building actually is, and what lives at the bottom of it. The building was, before the war, the headquarters of a company called Dunwich Borers LLC, a mining and materials corporation. On the surface, this seems unremarkable. Post-apocalyptic America is full of ruined corporate headquarters. But as you descend through the building's 3 levels, following audio logs left by a man named Jaime who came looking for his father, the nature of the place begins to shift. Jaime's father had become obsessed with a book. He'd left his family to pursue something south of the wasteland. Jaime tracked him to the Dunwich Building, following the trail deeper and deeper inside. His audio logs record his mental deterioration in real time, not through the usual mechanisms of radiation or drugs or physical danger, but through something that seems to be radiating from the building itself. By the time you reach the building's lowest level, the virulent underchambers, Jamie has been fully transformed into a feral ghoul and no longer recognizes himself. At the bottom of the building, in a cave that wasn't part of the original structure, there is an obelisk. It is wrapped in vines and skulls and carved with symbols that don't correspond to any known pre-war or post-war iconography. Feral ghouls are arranged around it in what looks disturbingly like devotion. A woman's arm reaches out from inside the stone, and if you stand close enough, you can hear the obelisk whispering a name, Al-Hazred. Abdul Al-Hazred is the fictional author of the Necronomicon in Lovecraft's mythology, the mad Arab who gazed too long at things that couldn't be unseen. The obelisk sometimes whispers a second name, Geeth. Both names appear in Jaime's final audio log, repeated over and over, a man's mind reduced to syllables. The game gives you no explanation for any of this. Mystery 25. Who founded Dunwich Borers and what they were really mining for? Cut content from the Point Lookout DLC, which extended the Dunwich story in fascinating ways, revealed that the company was founded by a man named Richard Dunwich, who was an ancestor of Obadiah Blackhall. That name, Blackhall, matters because it connects to the DLC's central questline around a book called The Criv Beckney. The Criv Beckney is a ritual grimoire, an evil text that the swamp folk of Point Lookout have been using in ceremonies for generations. Obadiah Blackhall wants it back. A missionary woman named Marcella warns you not to give it to him. And in the DLC, you eventually discover that the only way to destroy the Criv Beckney is to take it to the Dunwich Building and press it against the obelisk. Why the obelisk? Why does it consume the book? What does it gain from doing so? The game doesn't say. What it implies through context, through the connections between the Dunwich family, the Blackhall family, the book, the obelisk, and the entity whose name sounds like Geeth or Al-Hazred, is that there is something genuinely supernatural at work in the Fallout universe. Something that predates nuclear war, predates recorded history, something that has been waiting in dark places beneath the earth for an opportunity that the war may have provided. Mystery 26. Ugg Qualtoth. This is the name found in the Fallout 3 official game guide and in terminal entries scattered across the game's documents for the entity that appears to be connected to the Dunwich obelisk. The guide describes it as an alien entity. Not alien in the sense of coming from another planet necessarily, but alien in the older sense, meaning profoundly foreign to human experience. The Dunwich family apparently knew about it long before the bombs fell. They purchased land in multiple locations, specifically to excavate sites where the entity's presence was felt. The mining company wasn't extracting marble. It was digging towards something. What makes Ugg-Qualtoth particularly interesting as a mystery is that it doesn't play by Fallout's usual rules. Most of Fallout's horrors have explanations grounded in science radiation, FEV, corporate malfeasance, the collapse of social structures. Even the ghosts in the machine are usually just computers running programs nobody remembered to turn off. But Ugg-Qualtoth is presented as genuinely, inexplicably supernatural. There is no scientific explanation offered for the obelisk's whispering. There is no technology inside the Dunwich building that could produce hallucinations. The entity appears to be real in a way that cannot be reduced to any of Fallout's usual explanatory frameworks, and the series has never decided to either confirm or deny what it actually is. Mystery 27. The Dunwich connection that runs across 3 games. Fallout 3 gave us the building and the obelisk. Point Lookout expanded the story with the Krivbekny and the Blackhall family. Fallout 4 added a 3rd entry, the Dunwich Borers, a marble quarry in the Commonwealth. Here, the connection to the original Fallout 3 location is never made explicit. The quarry just happens to be owned by the Dunwich Company, and as you descend through its levels, you experience flashbacks to pre-war events, visions of workers going about normal days that gradually give way to visions of ritual. In the deepest level, submerged in a pool of dark water, you find an altar. Resting on the altar is a weapon called Kremvh's Tooth, a sacrificial knife of obvious antiquity, its design like nothing else in the game. And beneath the rubble at the base of the altar, partially buried, is something that appears to be an enormous stone face. The face is a mystery in itself. It resembles decorative stone faces found throughout the Commonwealth's architecture in building lobbies, on public monuments, as Art Deco ornaments. The same model, players have noted, which implies that either the Art Deco designers of the pre-war world were drawing on something they'd seen at the Dunwich Quarry, or the Dunwich entity's iconography had quietly spread through pre-war American culture without anyone realizing what they were reproducing. Mystery 28. The Interloper in Fallout 76. Lucky Hole Mine, in West Virginia's Appalachian Wilderness, goes very deep and ends in a chamber with a massive, humanoid entity of stone and darkness that the local Mothman cult calls the Interloper. They worship it, they make sacrifices to it, and the friendly wing of the Mothman cult, the Enlightened, who follow a wise and benevolent wise Mothman that guided people to safety before the bombs fell, treats the Interloper's presence as a catastrophic corruption, something that drove the other half of their faith into violence and madness. The Interloper's chamber contains stone faces, large, carved, ancient, the same ones from Dunwich Borers. The connection between the Interloper and Ugg-Qualtoth has never been canonically confirmed, but the evidence pointing towards some kind of larger cosmology, a pantheon of old and terrible things that exist in the dark corners of Fallout's world, has accumulated across 3 games and shows no sign of being resolved. The Fallout role-playing game, published by Modiphius Entertainment, explicitly acknowledges Ugg-Qualtoth in its core rulebook, and even includes a quest seed about a pilgrimage of worshippers heading toward the Dunwich Borers to wake their sleeping god. That suggests the entity's story is not finished, that there may eventually be a reckoning in some future game between Fallout's science fiction framework and this older, weirder thing beneath it. Mystery 29. Why the ghouls inside the Dunwich building worship the obelisk. Feral ghouls in Fallout are generally understood to have lost their cognitive function. They attack on instinct. They do not communicate, plan, or exhibit behavior that looks like intention. But the ghouls in the Dunwich building are arranged around the obelisk in a posture that is indistinguishable from prayer. Some of them are prostrated before it. They don't attack the player until the player gets close enough to disturb their formation. Something about the obelisk is organizing their behavior, not overriding their ferality, but channeling it towards something that looks, from a distance, like reverence. What is the obelisk doing to the ghouls? Is it the radiation that makes the building so unusually hot? Concentrated in or emanating from the obelisk itself? Is it something else entirely? The game presents the image and leaves the mechanism unexplained. Mystery 30. The Krivbekni and its origin. The book is ancient. It clearly predates the war, and probably predates several centuries' worth of history, given its design and the practices associated with it. The swamp folk of Point Lookout have been using it in their rituals for generations long enough that no one in the DLC seems to know where it originally came from or who wrote it. Obadiah Blackhall wants it because it belongs to his family, and his family has apparently been connected to whatever the book describes for generations. But who wrote the Krivbekni? In Lovecraft's mythology, texts of this kind tend to have authors who encountered something they shouldn't have and spent the rest of their lives trying to describe it to anyone who would listen. The Krivbekni, by analogy, might be the record of someone's encounter with Ugg Qualtoth, the document left behind by a person who looked at the thing in the dark and came away changed. Mystery 31. Point Lookout Swamp Folk and their connection to the Dunwich Mysteries. The Swamp Folk of Point Lookout are one of Fallout's more unique enemy types, human, but deeply mutated, the result of generations of inbreeding in an isolated coastal region that's been steeped in radiation and probably in something worse than radiation. They use the Krivbekni. They conduct rituals. They seem to be aware of what they're serving in a way that the Dunwich Building's ghouls are not. Is there a line of succession that runs from the Dunwich family through the Blackhall family to the Swamp Folk? Did the worshippers of Ugg Qualtoth eventually devolve into the Swamp Folk after generations of exposure to whatever the entity radiates? The timeline almost works out, but nobody has confirmed it, and the game doesn't connect these dots explicitly. Mystery 32. The hallucinations in Dunwich borers and what they mean. The flashbacks you experience in Fallout 4's Dunwich Quarry are triggered at specific locations, which implies they're not random, they're being pulled from somewhere, whether from the site's psychic residue, from the sole survivor's own mind, or from the entity beneath the stone. The flashbacks show you pre-war events, first ordinary work, then ritual, then something that looks like sacrifice. Are these actual memories from the site? Is the entity using them to communicate? Are they warnings or invitations? The game presents them as atmosphere without ever answering what they're made of. Mystery 33. Kremva's Tooth and its name. KremVH is a name that doesn't appear anywhere else in Fallout 4's lore. It's not a known pre-war figure, not a corporate entity, not a reference anyone has traced to external mythology. The name has a quality to it, harsh consonants, that final H that suggests it was designed to sound ancient and inhuman. Is Kremva another name for Ugg Qualtoth? Is it the name of a different entity entirely? The knife's design and the altar context both imply that whatever KremV is, it has been receiving sacrifices for a very long time. Section 5. The Mysterious Stranger, a Myth That Walks. Let's talk about a man in a coat and a hat. He appears at the edge of your vision. Sometimes, when you're in a fight, you're not sure you can win. He steps out of shadows that shouldn't be deep enough to hide him. He lines up a shot with his old-fashioned revolver, fires once, and whatever he was aiming at goes down, and then he's gone. Not in the dramatic way that a departing character goes. There's no retreating figure, no last look back. One moment he's there, the next moment he isn't, and there's no space between those two moments where something could have happened. The Mysterious Stranger is one of the franchise's oldest recurring elements. He first appeared in the original 1997 Fallout as a perk, a random chance encounter during combat where an unnamed figure would show up and deliver a critical hit. In the original game, he was Flavor, a nod to the classic Western trope of the unnamed gunslinger, the stranger who rides into town and then disappears before you learn who he is. But over 6 games and a television series, he has accumulated just enough detail to shift from pure flavor to genuine mystery, a figure with a history that nobody fully knows, who has been operating in the wasteland for long enough that even the most well-traveled characters in the franchise can only guess at his nature. Mystery 34. Who is the mysterious stranger? The most popular theory in the community, and the one with the most textual support, is that the stranger is the same person across all of the games he appears in, that he has been operating in the American wasteland since at least the 2160s, when the original Fallout takes place, through the events of Fallout 3 in 2277, through the events of New Vegas in 2281, through Fallout 4 in 2287. That's over a century of active presence. He doesn't appear to age. He doesn't appear to need assistance. He operates alone. Nobody knows where he goes between appearances. The logical explanation in a post-nuclear world would be that he's a ghoul, someone who was exposed to the right kind of radiation at the right time and became effectively immortal through mutation. But the mysterious stranger doesn't look like a ghoul. He looks like a man in his prime, healthy, in clothing that seems too well maintained for something worn for 100 years. Another explanation would be that he's a synth, one of the Institute's artificial humans. But the Institute wasn't producing synths until relatively recently in the timeline, and the stranger has been around since before they existed. Mystery 35. Nick Valentine knows him. This is the most remarkable moment in the entire Mysterious Stranger narrative. Nick Valentine is a synth detective in Fallout 4 who carries the memories of a pre-war man alongside his own artificial consciousness. He's perceptive, intelligent, and deeply aware of how Fallout's world works. If you have Nick with you when the mysterious stranger appears, Nick will immediately recognize him. He'll say something to the effect of knowing who that is, and then he'll stop himself. He won't say the name. He'll just note that the stranger has been around the Commonwealth for a very long time, implying he knew about him from the Commonwealth's history before the player ever encountered him. That recognition from a character whose credibility and perception the game consistently validates is the strongest evidence in any of the games that the stranger is genuinely something other than a recurring gameplay. Perk. He's real within the fiction. He's known. And Nick, who knows an enormous amount about a great many things, chooses not to share what he knows. Mystery 36. The Lonesome Drifter and the Stranger's Possible Family. This is a New Vegas mystery that has been kicking around the community for 15 years. In the Mojave Wasteland, you can encounter a character called the Lonesome Drifter, a wandering guitarist who sits alone on a rock near a desert highway and plays music for nobody. He dresses in a manner that is strikingly similar to the mysterious stranger. He carries a unique weapon called the Mysterious Magnum. He mentions offhand that his father was someone he never knew, someone who was always moving. If you draw the Mysterious Magnum, it plays a distinctive guitar sting that also plays every time the mysterious stranger appears. The game does not confirm that the Lonesome Drifter is the stranger's son. It doesn't need to. The suggestion is enough. The Drifter is lonely and rootless in the way of someone who grew up without an anchor. He doesn't know who his father was. His weapon plays the same theme as his absent father's weapon, and he is, himself, a wanderer, perhaps inheriting something of that nature, or perhaps just demonstrating what it does to a person to grow up with a father who was always disappearing into other people's stories. Mystery 37. The Stranger's Apparent Invulnerability. Across 6 games and dozens of combat scenarios, the mysterious stranger has never been killed. Players have tried to shoot him. In some games, you can damage him, but he survives and departs. In others, targeting him at all seems to fail, in ways that shouldn't be mechanically possible. He operates in the middle of firefights, takes his shot, and departs without being hit. The explanation that this is simply a game mechanic protecting a recurring character is probably the most accurate one. But within the fiction of the games, it contributes to the growing sense that the stranger is not bound by the same rules as other people in the wasteland. Mystery 38. The stranger's connection to the Stranger Killer challenge in Fallout 4. In the Institute, there is a specific challenge entry that mentions something referred to as the Stranger Killer, apparently a target that the Institute has identified and wants eliminated. The challenge is vague enough that many players have assumed it refers to an enemy type, but some community members have pointed out that the phrasing is unusual and that it could be a reference to a specific individual the Institute considers a threat. The mysterious stranger has been interfering in wasteland conflicts for over a century. It would not be surprising if an organization as controlling and meticulous as the Institute had noticed his pattern of behavior and added him to a list somewhere. Mystery 39. The Stranger in the Television Series. Season 2 of the Fallout show introduced a character who, in appearance and behavior, seemed designed to evoke the mysterious stranger archetype, a lone operator who appears at pivotal moments and disappears without explanation. Whether this character is meant to be the same mysterious stranger from the games, or a distinct character drawing on the same archetype, was not confirmed by the showrunners. The ambiguity felt deliberate, a nod to the existing mystery rather than a resolution of it. Mystery 40. The Stranger's Weapon. The mysterious stranger always carries a .44 caliber magnum revolver of a specific, old-fashioned design. The mysterious magnum carried by the lonesome drifter appears to be the same model, or at least identical in every external detail. In Fallout lore, this kind of weapon was standard in the pre-war period, but the particular condition of the stranger's revolver seemingly never needing repair, always functional, is another small detail that points towards something unusual about his nature. A normal person using a firearm for over a century would have needed to replace or extensively repair it multiple times. The stranger's revolver shows no signs of wear. Section 6. Ghosts in the Data. Cut content and lost stories. Every Fallout game is, in a sense, two games. There's the one that shipped the one you played, with its quests and characters and locations. And there's the one that didn't, the one that exists in fragments inside the game's files, in developer statements and interviews, in beta builds and data-mined content. The gap between those two games is sometimes small and sometimes enormous, and the things that were cut often raise their own questions about what the finished product might have been. Mystery 41. The Fallout. New Vegas post-dam world that never was. New Vegas is among the most acclaimed RPGs ever made, built in roughly 18 months, a development timeline that is, by industry standards, genuinely insane for a game of that scope and quality. Given that timeline, it's not surprising that content was cut. What is surprising is how much of what was cut was fully conceived and partially built. Dialogue scripts, NPC records, location data, the evidence of a post-Hoover Dam world exists in the game's files. Quests were planned for after the main story concluded, allowing players to explore the Mojave under whichever faction had won the battle and see the consequences playing out. NPCs would have commented on the new political reality. Factions would have made moves. The Omertas, the crime family operating one of the Strip's major casinos, had a whole storyline that would have had them attempting to seize New Vegas from Mr. House after the dam battle, a kind of power vacuum play that the game hints at but never develops. Cutting the post-dam content was a time decision, not a creative one. Obsidian knew what they wanted to do. They just couldn't get it finished. Mystery 42. Ulysses, the companion who almost was. Ulysses is one of New Vegas's most fascinating characters, a man who has followed the courier's trail across the wasteland, who has a deeply personal relationship to the courier's history and choices, who serves as the antagonist of the game's Lonesome Road DLC. He's a compelling figure. He was almost more than that. Early in development, Ulysses was intended to be a companion, a traveling partner who could join you from the main game. His planned location was Wolfhorn Ranch, a small settlement where file names still reference him. He was going to be the only companion in the game who supported Caesar's Legion, giving that faction a more textured human representation than it has in the shipped game. His personal history with the courier, something the DLC gestures at but doesn't fully explain, was going to be developed over dozens of conversations as you traveled together. The creative decision to cut him as a companion and save him for the DLC climax was probably the right one, but it means that the character as he exists in the finished game is missing a dimension. He arrives in the DLC as a figure we're supposed to have feelings about, but those feelings have to be generated in a much shorter time than was originally planned. Mystery 43. The beta build discovered on an Xbox 360 development kit. In late 2025, a 2 GB file surfaced that turned out to be a beta build of Fallout New Vegas, containing content that had been cut before the game's release. The modding community went through it with extraordinary care and found cut NPCs with their own dialogue trees, additional voice lines for characters who shipped in reduced form, locations that appear on early design documents but not in the finished game, and design elements that suggest different versions of several major quests. Among the restorations that followed were the character Marilyn, a Securitron unit belonging to Mr. House, who was cut from the final game, and beta design elements for locations like the Prospector Saloon and Nipton train station that show earlier visions of how those areas were supposed to feel. Mystery 43 is all the things in that beta build that still haven't been identified, cataloged, or restored, the stories that are still sitting in that 2 GB file, waiting for someone to notice them. Mystery 44. Prim's Darker Origins. In the shipped game, Prim is a small, somewhat underwhelming town that serves as the site of a quest to find a new sheriff. It has a casino, the Vicky and Vance, named after fictional outlaw lovers that serves as a refuge for the town's inhabitants while you sort out their law enforcement problem. Leftover files from the game's development show that Prim was originally considerably darker. The Vicky and Vance casino was going to be full of bodies when you arrived, the aftermath of a massacre perpetrated by a rogue group of ex-NCR soldiers. The casino was going to be the scene of an ambush when you entered. That version of Prim has a specificity that the shipped version doesn't. It had a backstory that implied a messy history with the NCR's collapse in the region. Cut for time, but what remains in the files is enough to understand what was intended. Mystery 45. The Great Khan's initiation that never made it in. Scripts and string names hidden in the game files reveal that there was a planned quest for players who wanted to join the Great Khans, one of New Vegas's more interesting minor factions, a raider gang with a surprisingly complex culture and history. To join, you were supposed to fight another Khan in unarmed combat, in an arena-style challenge. Your items would be stored in a locker. You'd fight with your fists. It's a clean, characterful way to introduce the Khan's values, strength and directness, and earning your place through action rather than words. It was cut, leaving the Khans as a faction you can work with but never fully become part of, which is a subtle but real reduction in the game's role-playing depth. Mystery 46. Vault-24 and its history of brainwashing. As mentioned earlier, Vault-24 first existed in New Vegas only as a reference of Vault jumpsuit accessible through console commands, implying that the Vault existed somewhere in the Mojave but wasn't visible on the map. The TV show eventually depicted it, revealing its function as a facility for converting American citizens into communist sympathizers. But the show's depiction was brief enough that significant questions remain. How many people went through Vault-24? How effective was the conversion? Were people successfully returned to the surface as embedded agents? The show implies the experiment was real and functional, but its full scope is never detailed. Mystery 47. The Cut Freeside expansion. Freeside, the impoverished area surrounding the New Vegas Strip, was, in early development, a single continuous zone that included both its current sections as well as Mormon Fort as an integrated neighborhood. It was going to be larger, more populated, with more NPCs populating the streets and more side stories happening in the margins. The final version of Freeside has been described by the development team as a necessary cut, a city that was supposed to feel alive but arrived at launch feeling a bit thin. The cut content includes dialogue from local NPCs that would have added texture to the area's political situation. The conflict between the King's faction, local residents, and NCR soldiers, and several side storylines that explored individual characters in the neighborhood who ended up without quests attached to them. Mystery 48. Benny's scripted death in the original Fallout. New Vegas opening. One of the most iconic openings in RPG history. Benny shooting the courier in the Mojave Desert and leaving them for dead in a shallow grave was, in the original design, going to happen in-engine rather than through a pre-rendered cinematic. Scripts and animation data in the game files preserve the bones of this sequence. Benny and his crew appearing in the environment, the dialogue exchange, the shooting, the burial. Modders have reassembled these pieces well enough to demonstrate roughly what the in-engine version would have looked like, and the results are honestly rough character animations that don't quite sync, timing that feels off. It's easy to see why the decision was made to go pre-rendered, but the original scripted version contains details that the pre-rendered cinematic doesn't. The courier's location can be read from environmental cues, Benny's crew behaves slightly differently, and there are lines of dialogue that exist in the script but never appear in the shipped opening. Mystery 49. The Fate of the Cut Companions. New Vegas shipped with 8 companions, which is already a substantial roster. But the files suggest there were more planned. Dialogue trees reference characters in companion-style contexts who never appear as recruitable allies in the finished game. The most significant of these, beyond Ulysses, is a character whose design and partial scripts suggest they were meant to represent a different faction entirely, someone whose perspective would have provided a view of the Mojave's politics from an angle that none of the 8 shipped companions offer. Their identity has been partially reconstructed by the modding community, but enough information is missing that their full story remains speculative. Mystery 50. The Todd Howard Super Mystery in Fallout 4. Game designer Todd Howard, in promotional interviews ahead of Fallout 4's launch, mentioned that the game contained a mystery that nobody had solved, yet something he described as a super mystery, something he was genuinely curious to see players uncover. Years after the game's release, that mystery had not been officially identified. Various community theories have circulated, some pointing to specific terminal entries that seem to reference undiscovered content, others focused on sequence breaks or environmental details that don't add up. Howard was asked about it years later and reportedly confirmed it still hadn't been found. Whether it was a genuine hidden puzzle, a development artifact that was meant to be cut but wasn't, or a piece of marketing that was never backed up with actual content, is one of Fallout 4's enduring open questions. Let me take a breath here and move to a part of this franchise that gets less attention than the major entries, the quiet, detailed world building happening in the background, in the small stories that Bethesda and Obsidian embed into locations you might never visit. Section 7. The Capital Wasteland's Forgotten Corners. Fallout 3 is a game about Washington, D.C., but it's really a game about what happens to the things people leave behind. The Capital Wasteland is saturated with abandoned places, hospitals, schools, office complexes, residential neighborhoods, each of which tells a story about the people who were in them on October 23, 2077. Some of those stories are spelled out in terminal entries and audio logs. Many are told entirely through the arrangement of objects, and some of them are told through things that players mostly walk past without registering. Mystery 51. The Keller Family Bunker and its Scattered Transmissions. The Keller Family Bunker is one of the more carefully designed environmental puzzles in Fallout 3. 5 radio towers scattered across the Capital Wasteland each transmit a piece of a 5-part code in Morse. If you collect all 5 pieces and enter the completed code at the bunker's entrance, you'll find a pre-war stash left by someone preparing for exactly the disaster that happened. The bunker itself is interesting. The real mystery is the radio towers, 2 of which don't carry code transmissions. One of them broadcasts the voice of a father trying to find medicine for a sick child, a loop that has been playing for over 200 years with nobody to hear it. The other broadcasts only static laced with what sounds like inhuman moaning, coming from feral ghouls that have gathered near the broadcasting equipment for reasons nobody in the game explains. Mystery 51 is why those ghouls are there, drawn to the radio tower, staying near equipment that a feral ghoul has no reason to interact with. Mystery 52. The TES-4 sign in the Capital Wasteland. On a road sign along one of the Capital Wasteland's crumbled highways, barely noticeable if you're moving quickly, there's a reference code, TES-4. TES is the Elder Scrolls. 04 is the 4th entry in that series. Oblivion. Bethesda regularly hides cross-references between their major franchises in the background of their games, and this is one of the more visible ones in Fallout 3. But this one has a lore implication that most players miss. If Oblivion's universe and Fallout's universe share some kind of cosmological space even as a joke, even as a developer Easter egg then, the events of one could theoretically be known to characters in the other. Nobody in either franchise has ever noticed, and they probably never will, but the sign is there. Mystery 53. The secret NPC on Megaton's outer wall. If you access the PC console and use the no-clip command, which lets you pass through solid walls and then navigate to a specific point on Megaton's exterior, you'll find an NPC on a small observation platform that exists in the geometry of the map but is completely inaccessible through normal play. The NPC will greet you and ask how you managed to get there. He was placed by a developer specifically for this discovery. A note from the team to players who went looking beyond the boundaries. He's been there for 17 years. He doesn't have a name in the credits. He has a few lines of dialogue. He is, in a very small way, a ghost in the machine that Bethesda left for someone patient enough to find. Mystery 54. The Germantown Police Headquarters. And who was there at the end? There are several locations in Fallout 3 where the environmental storytelling tells a story without any audio logs or terminals to support it purely through the placement of skeletons, items, and structural damage. Germantown Police Headquarters is one of the strongest examples. The arrangement of remains in the building implies a siege, a group of people who fortified the police station and held out for as long as they could against something outside. The damage patterns on the walls suggest the attack came from multiple directions. There are no terminals explaining who was inside or what they were defending against. The story is told entirely through negative space, and it's a good story. It just doesn't have a conclusion. Mystery 55. Vault 106's drug and the player's hallucinations. When you venture deep enough into Vault 106, you will hallucinate. This is documented and not disputed. What isn't clear is what you're hallucinating. The game presents the experience as a first-person distortion color shift. Images of pre-war America bleed in and out of the present. The implication is that the drug in the air is psychoactive in the classical sense, producing visual distortions. But some community members have pointed out that the specific imagery in the hallucinations has a pattern that what you seem to be seeing are moments from the vault's history, as if the drug isn't just distorting your perception, but opening a channel to something recorded in the environment. This might be overthinking a game engine effect, or it might not be. Mystery 56. The Dunwich Building's connection to the rest of the Capital Wasteland. There are several other locations in Fallout 3 that seem, thematically and in terms of atmosphere, to share something with the Dunwich Building, places that produce an effect that the game's normal logic doesn't fully explain. The abandoned shack east of the Dunwich Building is surrounded by a persistently high radiation field that shows no source. Animal spawns near the Dunwich Building are unusual compared to surrounding areas. Radiation readings inside the building itself are dramatically higher than they should be for a pre-war office building, and the concentration increases dramatically as you descend. Whatever is at the bottom of Dunwich Building, it has been affecting the immediate environment for over 200 years. The radius of that effect has never been mapped. Mystery 57. The McClellan family townhouse in Georgetown. The house at 2096 Bradley Lane in Georgetown is one of Fallout 3's most carefully constructed small-scale environmental stories. The family clearly had means the townhouse is larger and better maintained, even in post-apocalyptic ruin than surrounding properties. The family had a robot, which is still operational and will greet you as if the family is expected back shortly. There are signs of a child's life in the house toys, a bedroom, a bookshelf with children's books still on it, and in the basement, a Mr. Handy unit that was clearly the family's domestic robot has been running cleaning cycles on a kitchen that hasn't needed cleaning for 200 years. The mystery isn't the family's fate. The war is obvious enough. The mystery is the detail of their life before, reconstructed through objects, and the robot still serving a household that will never need to be served again. Mystery 58. The alien crash site near Recon Craft Theta. In the Capital Wasteland, north of the MDPL, 16 power station, there is a crashed UFO. A trail of alien power cells leads from the crash site toward a hatch in the ground. If you have the Mothership Zeta DLC, this is where the abduction sequence begins. But for players without the DLC, the crash site simply exists a downed spacecraft with no explanation, no NPC to address it, no quest tied to it. The power cells suggest the aliens weren't dead when they landed. They went somewhere. Mystery 58 is what that alien did between crashing and whenever the DLC's events take place, where it went, what it saw of the Capital Wasteland, and whether it interacted with anyone before the lone wanderer was taken. Mystery 59. Three Dog's background. Three Dog, the DJ of Galaxy News Radio and one of Fallout 3's most memorable characters, has been broadcasting from the Washington, D.C. ruins for years. His signal is the soundtrack of your Capital Wasteland experience. He's aware, opinionated, politically engaged in a post-war sense, and deeply committed to the idea of the good fight, his phrase for continuing to resist the encroaching darkness and maintaining something like civilization in the rubble. But Three Dog's personal history is almost entirely absent from the game. How old is he? Where was he born? How did he come to be a DJ? Who built GNR's equipment? When did he start broadcasting? None of these questions have answers in the game's lore. He exists fully formed, in the middle of his story, with no beginning visible. Mystery 60. The Nuka-Cola Quantum and its formula. Nuka-Cola Quantum is a rare variant of the franchise's signature soft drink, identifiable by its blue glow. The glow comes from a small amount of strontium, 90 in the formula, technically mildly radioactive. Technically something that should not have been approved for public consumption. The in-game explanation is that it was a limited release product designed to generate buzz. But the terminal entries at the Nuka-Cola plant in the game suggest that the formula was developed under pressure from corporate management, specifically because a glowing drink would be more marketable and that the scientists who raised safety concerns were overruled. Mystery 60 is how many bottles of Quantum were actually distributed before the war, and whether anyone outside the company knew about the strontium addition. The in-game amount of available Quantum suggests it was genuinely limited, but the reason it was limited might not be purely marketing. Section 8. The Commonwealth's Hidden Architecture. Fallout 4 takes place in Boston, Massachusetts, which is one of the most historically layered cities in the United States, a place where colonial-era buildings stand alongside industrial-era factories and modern by 2077 standards architecture. That layering gives the game's environment a texture that rewards exploration differently than the relatively flat geography of the capital wasteland. Boston is built on itself. There are always floors beneath floors, rooms beneath rooms, histories beneath histories. The Commonwealth's mysteries reflect that architecture. Mystery 61. What the Institute actually wanted the sole survivor to do. This has been debated extensively in the community because the Institute's questline, if you follow it, presents Father the sole survivor's son, Sean, as a figure who has been waiting for you specifically. He allowed you to be woken from cryo-sleep. He sent Kellogg to retrieve Sean from Vault 111. He could have intervened at any point and didn't. The interpretation that makes most sense is that Sean was running a very long-term experiment on the sole survivor, testing whether a pre-war person could adapt to the Commonwealth, or testing the sole survivor's specific qualities for a purpose that the main quest never fully explains. But some community members have argued that Sean's motivation is simpler. He wanted to see his parent. That the enormous, elaborate apparatus of the Institute's interest in the sole survivor is, at its core, a very old man trying to reach his parent before he dies. Both interpretations can be true simultaneously, which is part of what makes the Institute's questline so interesting even when it frustrates people. Mystery 62. The Fate of Director Zimmer. Zimmer is a minor character in Fallout 3, a representative of the Institute who appears in Rivet City, looking for a runaway android. In Fallout 4, if you reach the Institute and ask about him, one of the Institute's internal security personnel will tell you that Zimmer went on a mission to retrieve some high-profile units and has been listed as missing ever since. This is the only information the game provides. No body, no record of what happened to him. No one else in the Institute seems to have a strong opinion about his disappearance. Given the Capital Wasteland's general hostility and Zimmer's relatively limited combat capabilities, the most obvious explanation is that he died in the field. But the high-profile units he was after the framing suggests they were significant enough to send a director-level operative were never identified. Mystery 62 is what Zimmer found, and what found him. Mystery 63. The Mannequins. This one has a life in the Fallout 4 community that is somewhat disproportionate to its actual in-game presence, but it's earned. Throughout the Commonwealth, there are buildings where mannequins have been arranged in tableaux that suggest deliberate human placement. Not random, not just decorative figures knocked over by time and weather. In some locations, mannequins are positioned in ways that look like scenes. A dinner table with mannequins seated around it, a bedroom with a mannequin in a chair reading, a street corner with a group of mannequins gathered as if in conversation. The most famous example is a house where mannequins are positioned with what appears to be emotional intentionality. They're arranged to suggest grief, or tenderness, or confrontation. The game provides no explanation for who arranged them or why. The community has produced two distinct theories. Either a survivor, possibly slightly disturbed, was using the mannequins to recreate human social situations as a form of coping with isolation, or a group of survivors with a very specific aesthetic were doing it as art. Neither theory is confirmed. The mannequins just stand there, having their moments, surrounded by a world that has no interest in explaining them. Mystery 64. The island's Mother of the Fog in the Far Harbor DLC. Far Harbor is the game's most atmospherically dense DLC, set on an island off the coast of Maine that is perpetually covered in radioactive fog. Among the island's residents is the Children of the Atom, a religious faction that worships radiation as a divine force, which is an idea that functions better as a society than you might expect in this setting. To advance the DLC's main questline, You undergo a vision quest that is triggered by the children. During this quest, you encounter a ghostly figure called the Mother of the Fog, a woman, indistinct, always slightly ahead of you. She never speaks in a way that fully communicates meaning. She leads you to specific locations. She is not obviously the product of the radiation or any technology the game identifies. Mystery 64 is what the Mother of the Fog actually is, a genuine supernatural entity, a hallucination specific to the island's conditions, an artificial projection from some technology nobody has identified, or something the DLC gestures toward without committing to. Mystery 65. Codsworth's Hidden Name Library. Codsworth, the sole survivor's robot butler who has been maintaining the empty house in Sanctuary Hills for 210 years, can recognize and say approximately 1,000 pre-recorded names. This is a technical achievement and a charming personal detail. But players found that the library of names includes entries that shouldn't be there from a pure recording standpoint. Names that are vulgar. Names that are references to other games. Gordon, Dragonborn, Doomguy. Names that seem like internal jokes from the development team. The most remarkable is that if you name yourself Fallout 5, Codsworth will say it. The developers recorded it. It was intentional. At some point during Fallout 4's development, someone decided to preserve that joke, a robot saying, "Yes sir, ma'am, Fallout 5 inside the shipping product." That joke was recorded in 2015. A decade later, Fallout 5 is still not out. The robot is still waiting. Mystery 66. The Super Mutant Behemoth Origin. Super mutants in the Commonwealth, unlike those in the capital Wasteland, were created by the Institute rather than by Vault-Tec or government FEV facilities. The Institute's version of the FEV was developed internally, and the super mutants it produces are, on the whole, more advanced cognitively than their Vault-87 counterparts. A small number of them have achieved genuine intelligence and have formed their own communities. But the behemoth's massive, barely coherent, seemingly beyond what the FEV should be capable of producing in terms of sheer size, represent a mystery within a mystery. The Institute's own records on the FEV don't account for behemoth-scale mutations. They seem to be FEV's logical endpoint if a subject is exposed repeatedly over long periods, growing rather than stabilizing. But whether this was observed and documented anywhere, or whether the behemoths are a mutation trajectory that nobody expected, is never resolved. Mystery 67. The Boston Catacombs. Beneath several locations in downtown Boston, there are tunnels that appear to predate the war, some of them significantly older than the 1950s retro-futurism of the Commonwealth's surface aesthetic. Boston is a genuinely old city, and the layering shows in Fallout 4's underground spaces. Some of these tunnel systems have inhabitants or histories that the main game addresses. Others are simply present, without quests or explanations attached to them. Among these are segments of tunnel that don't connect to anything else on the map, that appear in the geography but have no in-game entry point, that exist as geometry without serving any navigational or narrative purpose. Mystery 67 is whether these sealed tunnel segments are leftovers from development cut locations that were sealed rather than removed, or whether they represent spaces that were intended to be found through methods that didn't make it into the shipped game. Mystery 68. The USS Constitution Quest and the Captain's Logs. The USS Constitution in Fallout 4 is an 18th century frigate that has been automated and launched into the air by robots, following a program so old they've lost track of what it was originally supposed to accomplish. The quest involving the ship is deliberately comedic, a nice tonal contrast to some of the game's heavier material. But buried in the captain's log terminals aboard the ship are entries from a pre-war period when the ship was first being automated, and some of those entries describe the automation project in terms that don't quite match the official military program. The language implies someone had a personal investment in the ship's digitization. Someone who wasn't just following orders but was doing something they wanted to do for reasons the official documents don't. Capture. Mystery 68 is who that person was and what they were really trying to preserve. Mystery 69. The invisible wall around the Commonwealth's northern edge. At the northern border of Fallout 4's map, there is an invisible barrier that prevents further travel. Most open-world games have these. But the northern edge of the Commonwealth map sits just below the main border and in the canonical geography of the Fallout universe. What lies beyond that edge is Far Harbor's territory, the rocky, fog-covered coast that becomes the DLC's setting. Players who found ways to go beyond the barrier before the DLC launched reported encountering an empty, featureless extension of the landscape that eventually gave way to nothing. Mystery 69 is what the space between the main Commonwealth and the DLC island actually looks like in the full geometry of the game. Whether the journey that should take days of travel in lore is represented in any form in the game's data or simply doesn't exist, the way that distances between Fallout's locations are always compressed relative to their real-world equivalents. Mystery 70. The Institute's teleportation technology. The Institute can teleport people and objects across the Commonwealth, which is the most advanced technology demonstrated by any faction in Fallout 4. The technology is remarkable enough that the Brotherhood of Steel lists it as one of their primary strategic concerns. But the Institute's teleportation has limits that are never fully explained. It can only function at certain distances. It requires specific receiving equipment in some applications, and it doesn't seem to work across the major dimensional spaces of the game, the wasteland, and the Institute's underground facility. Mystery 70 is the underlying physics of Institute teleportation, which the game gestures at without ever fully describing. How does it work? What are its actual limitations? The scientists in the Institute's research departments have terminal entries describing ongoing research into expanding the technology's range, but those entries cut off without conclusions, and the scientific principles involved remain unexplained. Section 9. Appalachia's Deep Secrets. Fallout 76 takes place in West Virginia's Appalachian region in 2102, the earliest point in Fallout's timeline after the war, only 25 years after the bombs fell. This creates a different atmosphere than the later games. The wound is fresher. The world hasn't settled into its post-apocalyptic patterns yet. The vaults have only recently opened. The people who remember the old world are still alive, still processing what happened. And in that rawness, there is a particular kind of haunting. West Virginia also happens to be a place with its own rich tradition of folklore, cryptid legends, and strange regional stories. The Mothman, the Flatwoods Monster, the Snallygaster, Grafton. Bethesda used all of this, weaving the state's actual mythology into the Fallout framework in a way that blurs the line between the game's invented horrors and the real-world stories the places were already carrying. Mystery 71. The Mothman and the Wise Mothman. In Point Pleasant, West Virginia, a real town, famous in our world for its 1,966 to 67 Mothman sightings, Fallout 76 places a Mothman museum and a Mothman statue. There is a cult. There are hostile worshippers. And there is the Mothman itself, which appears as a rare encounter, enormous, black-winged, red-eyed, capable of bestowing visions on those it encounters. Within the lore, the Mothman cult is split into two factions. The wise Mothman worshippers, who follow a benevolent variant they believe guided their ancestors to safety before the bombs fell, and the Eclipse Eye worshippers, who follow the red-eyed predatory form and engage in violence in its honor. The mystery is whether the Mothman is real within the fiction, not just a mutated creature, but a genuinely prophetic being that warns specific people about the coming apocalypse. The evidence in the game supports this. The wise Mothman's followers have documents suggesting that some of their ancestors survived the bombs because they followed what appeared to be supernatural guidance. If the Mothman is real and genuinely prophetic, the question of what else it knows becomes one of the franchise's most interesting open threads. Mystery 72, the interloper at Lucky Hole Mine, and its relationship to the Mothman mythology. As discussed earlier, the interloper is a massive, stationary entity at the bottom of Lucky Hole Mine that the Eclipse Eye cultists worship and the wise Mothman worshippers fear. The stone faces in the interloper's chamber are the same design as those in Fallout 4's Dunwich borers. The implication, which the game never makes explicit, is that the interloper and the Dunwich entity are either the same being or beings of the same order. This would mean the Lovecraftian horror of Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland extends west to Appalachia and probably further. How many of these entities are there? Are they independent or connected? The Mothman's prophetic quality and the interloper's hunger seem to be opposite in character, one warning humanity, the other consuming it, which suggests a genuine cosmological conflict might be happening in the background of the franchise. Mystery 73, the secret quest that takes 7 real-life days to complete. One of Fallout 76's most elaborate hidden stories involves a character named Calvin Van Lowe, the creator of the imposter Sheepsquatch boss encounter. The quest chain that reveals his full story requires players to complete several prerequisite storylines, then locate holotapes scattered across Appalachia and listen to them in reverse chronological order. Some steps of this quest have cooldown timers that cannot be bypassed. The complete sequence, from first trigger to final revelation, takes approximately 7 real days to complete in real time, not game time, but actual calendar days. This is one of the longest quest structures in Fallout's history in terms of real-world commitment, and many players never completed it. Those who did found a story about obsession, isolation, and the length someone might go to in order to feel like they've created something meaningful after the world ended. Mystery 74, the Order of Mysteries and its origin. The Order of Mysteries was a pre-war organization that trained young women in the arts of espionage and combat using a framework built around the Mistress of Mystery, a fictional pulp fiction heroine. When the bombs fell, the organization went underground. Literally, they operated out of a hidden basement in Riverside Manor and continued training members to protect civilians in the wasteland. The founders' holotapes trace a genuinely moving story of a woman trying to give her daughter and her daughter's generation something worth having in a world that had just ended. The mystery isn't the Order's origin, the game reveals it fairly thoroughly, but its fate. The Order's last members died off or disappeared at some point before the game's events. Their facility is intact but empty. The question of what happened to the final generation of mistresses, where they went, whether they continued the mission alone or abandoned it, is never answered. Mystery 75, the Pioneer Scout holotapes and the children who made them. Before the war, the Pioneer Scouts were Fallout's version of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, a government-backed youth organization that taught wilderness survival, civic responsibility, and national loyalty. Their camp in Appalachia still stands, populated by automated robots following the last program they were given. But among the camp's materials are personal holotapes left by individual Scouts' children, some quite young, recording their experiences on camping trips and badges and competitions. These holotapes are among the most emotionally affecting pieces of environmental storytelling in Fallout 76 because they capture the ordinary texture of children's lives in the days and weeks before the world ended. The children are happy in these recordings. They don't know what's coming. Mystery 75 is a question without a mystery. In the traditional sense, it's just the weight of knowing that these children existed and that the world they're describing so enthusiastically ended on October 23rd, 2077, and wondering what happened to each of them specifically. Mystery 76, the Flatwoods Monster and its origin. The Flatwoods Monster, another real West Virginia cryptid. This one from a 1952 sighting appears in Fallout 76 as an alien entity that wanders certain areas of Appalachia. It is clearly not a mutated animal. It doesn't fit any of the FEV-based mutation patterns in the franchise. It doesn't behave like a pre-war robot. Its origin is never explained. It's simply there, in the Appalachian wilderness, walking its rounds, appearing to players who happen to be in the right area. The game's implication seems to be that this is actually an alien being one of the extraterrestrial visitors whose presence in the franchise runs from the original Fallout through Mothership Zeta. But what it's doing in West Virginia specifically, whether it has a mission or is simply stranded, is never addressed. Mystery 77, the golf course and its hidden bunker. In the Savage Divide region of Appalachia, there is a pre-war golf resort. Wealthy people played golf there before the bombs fell. A wealthy person's golf resort is not on its face the most mysterious place in the franchise. But beneath the resort, in a location that requires specific knowledge of the building's layout to find, there is a small sealed bunker that doesn't correspond to any known military or Vault-Tec facility. Its contents suggest a very specific person was using it for purposes that weren't the official ones. The bunker's records reference ongoing relationships with multiple government agencies while maintaining an identity as a civilian. Mystery 77 is whether this was a private citizen who happened to have unusual connections, or a government operative using the resort as cover, and if the latter, what program they were running. Mystery 78, the New River Gorge region and the anomalies around it. The New River Gorge is one of Appalachia's most visually distinctive locations, a deep river valley with dramatic cliff walls that provides one of the game's most striking environmental moments when you first see it. But the surrounding area has a higher density of unusual enemy spawns, unusual weather patterns, and unusual radiation readings than can be accounted for by the region's history. Nothing in the game's lore fully explains this concentration. The closest explanation is that one of the region's pre-war facilities was running experiments that affected the local environment, but the specific facility and the specific experiments are never identified. Mystery 78 is what was happening in that valley before the war that made the post-war version of it so specifically strange. Mystery 79, the Grafton Monster and its lack of lore. Grafton, a real West Virginia town, and the site of one of Fallout 76's less welcoming environments, is the home territory of the Grafton Monster, a massive, headless creature with enormous arms that appears as an event boss in the game. It is, by physical appearance, unlike anything else in Fallout's bestiary. It's not an FEV mutation in any pattern that matches others in the franchise. It's not a robot. It appears to be biological. The game does not explain what it is, where it came from, or what relationship it has to the real-world Grafton Monster legend. The Grafton Monster of folklore was described as a large, dark, humanoid creature with no head. The Fallout version shares this characteristic. Whether this is purely a referential design choice or whether the game intends some deeper connection to the location's history is unknown. Mystery 80, the Atlas Observatory and the signal it was tracking. The Atlas Observatory in Fallout 76 was a pre-war astronomical facility that was, at the time of the bombs, tracking something. The telescope logs indicate that whatever it was tracking was coming from outside the solar system and had a trajectory that ended somewhere on Earth. The logs are fragmentary, the facility's records were incomplete even before the war, and the tracking data doesn't specify whether the object was natural or artificial. Given the presence of the Flatwoods Monster and the franchise's general relationship with extraterrestrial entities, the implication seems to be that Atlas was watching something come in. What that something was, where it landed, and whether it is connected to any of the game's cryptid encounters is left open. Section 10. The Mojave's Unanswered Questions. The Mojave Wasteland is the most politically complex setting in the franchise's history. Where Fallout 3's capital Wasteland is essentially a survival story, a young person trying to find their father in a hostile world, and Fallout 4's Commonwealth is a story about identity and continuity, New Vegas is a story about power, about who gets to decide what the future looks like, and what it costs them to get there. The four factions vying for control of Hoover Dam, the New California Republic, Caesar's Legion, Mr. House, and the player's own wildcard option, each represent a different theory of how civilization rebuilds after catastrophe. Each of them is right about some things and catastrophically wrong about others, and the game's refusal to cleanly endorse any of them is part of what makes it so interesting to think about. It's also a setting that generates mysteries at almost every level. Mystery 81. What happened after Hoover Dam? The Battle of Hoover Dam is New Vegas's climactic event, the moment when the game's political maneuvering resolves into violence, and the player's choices determine who controls the Colorado River crossing and, by extension, the Mojave's future. But the game ends with the battle's conclusion and a brief narration. The aftermath, the actual governing, the reconstruction, the resistance and adaptation of those who lost is described in text and voiceover but never played through. Obsidian designed a post-dam period that was cut from the game, and the scripts that survive suggest it would have been genuinely interesting. The TV show, which is set years after New Vegas's events, seems to have definitively addressed some of what happened. The NCR's capital, Shady Sands, was destroyed at some point between the game and the show, apparently bombed, but the specific events between New Vegas's ending and the show's beginning are not fully charted. What actually happened to the Mojave's different factions in the years after the player's intervention is one of the franchise's most consequential unresolved stories. Mystery 82. What Mr. House was doing with the platinum chip. The central MacGuffin of New Vegas, the chip the courier was carrying when Benny shot them, is a data storage device containing critical upgrade programs for Mr. House's army of Securitrons. The chip was supposed to be delivered to House. Benny intercepted it because he had his own plans for it. But the chip was on its way to House already, which means House commissioned its creation and transport. Who made the chip? Under what circumstances was it manufactured? Why was it being delivered via courier rather than through House's own infrastructure? The game's explanation that external production and transport was necessary for reasons having to do with the chip's contents is somewhat vague. Mystery 82 is the full story of the chip's creation and the people who built it. Mystery 83. The nature of Mr. House's extended survival. Robert Edwin House is, at the time of New Vegas, roughly 261 years old. He survived the Great War because he had calculated its probability to within a very narrow window and had specifically arranged to be in protective stasis when the bombs fell, having cured himself of a terminal illness using experimental technology. That's the in-game explanation. But the physical reality of his survival, sustained through a life support system and neural interface in the Lucky 38's penthouse, is remarkable in ways that the game doesn't fully address. His mind has been running continuously for over 200 years. His body is mostly kept alive by machines. His consciousness has been in contact with his casino systems for decades. Mystery 83 is what that does to a person over 200 years, and whether the Mr. House the player meets is still recognizably the man who went under before the war. Mystery 84. The Kings faction and their Elvis Presley connection. The Kings are one of the Mojave's smaller factions, a gang of young men based in Freeside who modeled themselves on a person they call the King. Their leader is called the King. Their dress, their speech patterns, their body language all derive from this figure. They have a school of impersonation, but they don't know who their model is. They don't seem to recognize the name Elvis Presley. Their entire cultural identity derives from a person they have no knowledge of, absorbed through what appears to have been an old video archive in a school that was the King's base before the war. Mystery 84 is how you lose the source of your entire culture. How a generation grows up in the image of someone they don't know they're imitating, worshipping a style without knowing its origin. The game handles this with remarkable subtlety. The Kings are fully realized characters who happen to not know who Elvis was, and the gap between what they think they are and what they actually are is quietly fascinating. Mystery 85, Mr. New Vegas and the question of his programming. Radio New Vegas is hosted by Mr. New Vegas, a warm, charming, eloquent AI that reads the news and plays music from what sounds like a broadcast booth somewhere in the Mojave. He is fully realized as a character. You hear him comment on the courier's actions as they happen, note major events in the wasteland, joke mildly, spin records. He sounds like a person. According to developer statements during the game's promotion, he was created by Mr. House before the war. Apparently one of House's projects was the creation of an AI radio personality who could maintain the station indefinitely. Wayne Newton, the performer known as Mr. Las Vegas, provides the voice. And the choice of Newton is clearly a joke at House's expense, the richest man in Nevada, creating an artificial version of a real entertainment icon as his personal radio project. But Mr. New Vegas never says anything pro-House. He's not propaganda, he's just a radio host. Mystery 85 is why House built him, if not for influence. Was it entertainment? Loneliness? An attempt to maintain something of the old world's texture that he genuinely missed? Mystery 86. The Vault-11 Sole Survivor. Vault-11's dark history ends with one survivor, the person who walked out after the Vault's experiment concluded. There is a model for this character in the game's files. He was going to appear in the game, a man carrying 200 years of that Vault's history with him, the only one who made it through. He was cut. But his file exists. He has a visual design. He has an implication of a backstory. And the question of where he went, a man who was the last survivor of the Vault-11 massacres, who watched his community destroy itself, who walked into the Mojave alone, is one of the franchise's small, haunting gaps. He's out there, somewhere in New Vegas's version of the world, if you believe the fiction. Walking. Probably not talking about it. Mystery 87. The followers of the apocalypse and their full scope. The followers of the Apocalypse are one of the Mojave's most interesting minor factions, a humanitarian organization dedicated to education, medicine, and the preservation of pre-war knowledge. They operate out of the old Mormon fort in Freeside. They have members throughout the Mojave and beyond. They were involved in the NCR's early development. In New Vegas, they're presented as a relatively small operation doing their best under difficult circumstances. But their organizational reach seems, from dialogue hints and faction history, to be considerably larger than what the game shows. Mystery 87 is the full scope of the followers, their origins, their organizational structure, their resources, and their long-term plans for the wasteland beyond the Mojave. Mystery 88, Caesar's Legion and the land east of the Colorado. The Legion occupies a massive geographic area east of the Colorado River, but the player never sees it. The entirety of the Legion's territory, their home base, their social organization, the reality of daily life in Legion-controlled land, is described by characters in the game rather than shown. This is clearly a development constraint, not a deliberate creative mystery, but the result is that one of the game's 4 major factions is essentially a rumor in terms of its physical reality. What does the Legion's territory actually look like? How many people live under Caesar's rule? What is the day-to-day experience of living in Legion-controlled areas? Mystery 88 is the unseen half of New Vegas's world. Mystery 89, what Benny was planning to do after he killed Mr. House. Benny had a plan. He'd intercepted the Platinum chip, he had Yes Man, a reprogrammed Securitron, as his tool, and he intended to use House's own infrastructure to seize control of New Vegas. But the plan, as Benny describes it when you can actually get him to talk about it, has significant gaps. He could replace House with Yes Man's flexibility, yes. But ruling New Vegas is considerably more complex than simply taking over the Lucky 38. The Strip's various factions, the NCR's presence, the Legion's threat. Benny's plan doesn't seem to account for any of these in any detail he shares. Mystery 89 is whether Benny actually had a fully developed plan or whether he was improvising. A man who'd made one successful move and was banking on being smart enough to figure out the next one when he got there. Mystery 90. What happened to the Courier before the game's events? The Courier is the player character in New Vegas, and like most Fallout protagonists, their background is intentionally undefined to allow player projection. But in New Vegas, more than in other games, there are hints at a history. Ulysses knows the Courier. The package they were carrying when they were shot was specifically routed through them. Various NPCs in the Mojave have heard of them before they arrive, a reputation that preceded the game's events. Mystery 90 is the Courier's life before the game begins, all the deliveries, the people encountered, the history with Ulysses that the Lonesome Road DLC gestures at without fully explaining. The Courier existed. They had a past. That past shaped who they were when the game began, and we only ever see the aftermath of it. Section 11. Developer Secrets and the Architecture of the Games. Every Fallout game contains a layer of development history that sits just below the player's view. Technical decisions, cut content artifacts, in-jokes, and references that only make sense if you know something about how the games were made or who made them. Some of these are genuinely delightful. Some are puzzling. And some of them raise questions about the game's development that have never been fully answered. Mystery 91. Why the first Fallout was almost a GURPS game. The special system, strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, luck is now so fundamental to Fallout's identity that it's difficult to imagine the franchise without it. But it almost didn't exist. The game was in development using the GURPS rules system when the deal with Steve Jackson Games fell through over the game's violent content. Tim Kaine and his team then had to invent an entirely new RPG system in roughly 6 weeks to replace it. The fact that Special has proven to be one of the most durable and flexible character systems in the medium's history is remarkable given the circumstances of its creation. Mystery 91 is what would have been different if the GURPS negotiation had succeeded, whether the game's design would have changed substantially or whether the same fundamental structure would have emerged anyway, just organized under different terminology. Mystery 92. The GURPS password hidden in Fallout 3. A small tribute to this history survives in Fallout 3. GURPS can appear as a password when hacking computer terminals. It's a minor detail, easily missed, that connects back to the franchise's origins. The inclusion is a reminder from the Bethesda team to the people who built the world they inherited. Mystery 93. The development of the Vault Boy. The Vault Boy, that cheerful thumbs-up cartoon figure that appears throughout the games in perks and stats and promotional material, is one of the most recognizable icons in gaming. He was designed during the original game's development to embody the optimistic but hollow propaganda aesthetic of Fallout's pre-war America. His constant positivity in the face of increasingly terrible game mechanics, there is a Vault Boy raising a thumbs up in a perk that gives you radiation resistance by giving you cancer, which is peak Fallout humor, is the key to his charm. Mystery 93 is the full story of his creation, who designed him, what references they were drawing on, and how consciously they were thinking about the satirical potential of putting a cheerful cartoon mascot in the context of nuclear apocalypse. Mystery 94. The Wasteland Survival Guidebooks in Fallout 3. Throughout Fallout 3, you can find copies of a book called the Wasteland Survival Guide, which is a practical manual for living in the post-apocalyptic world. Late in the game, you can work with a character named Moira Brown to write a new edition of the guide, a series of quests that involves testing various survival methods. The guide is presented as existing in the world before you arrive, which implies someone wrote it. Mystery 94 is who wrote the original Wasteland Survival Guide, who this experienced survivor was, what their background was, whether they're still alive, and why the guide contains the specific information it does rather than other equally useful things. Mystery 95. The Galaxy News radio signal and how far it reaches. Three Dogs GNR signal is a recurring presence in Fallout 3, but its broadcast range has always seemed inconsistent with what a single radio tower in Washington, D.C. could realistically achieve. Some in-game characters, in areas far from Washington, seem to be aware of GNR even though the signal strength shouldn't reach them. Mystery 95 is whether GNR has relay equipment hidden somewhere in the capital wasteland that extends its range, or whether the discrepancy is simply an inconsistency in the game's world building. Mystery 96. The Fiends' 3 leaders in New Vegas. The Fiends, a raider group in the Mojave, have 3 notable sub-leaders who roam their territory and who can be killed for a bounty quest. Each of them is a fully realized NPC with their own weapons and characteristics. What makes them a mystery is the dialogue associated with them. Each leader has lines they never get to deliver in normal gameplay because the bounty quest sends you to kill them before you can have a meaningful conversation. Driver Nephi talks about his kill count. Cook has a story about fire. Motor Runner has opinions about the Mojave. These are characters with inner lives who exist in the game almost entirely as combat encounters. Mystery 96 is the deeper characterization that Obsidian planned for them and ran out of time to implement. Mystery 97. The Black Mountain Radio Station and Tabitha. Tabitha runs the Black Mountain Radio Station from the top of a mountain east of New Vegas, broadcasting unhinged propaganda for her society of super mutants. She's one of the game's most darkly comic characters, delusional, fierce, completely committed to a vision of super mutant society that exists primarily in her own head. Her backstory exists in fragments across the game's terminals, and it's a surprisingly complete picture of how someone ends up where Tabitha is. But there are gaps in the record, and some of her terminal entries reference events and people that the player never encounters. Mystery 97 is the full story of Tabitha's rise to whatever it is she is. The events between her creation as a super mutant and her establishment at Black Mountain. Mystery 98. Chris Avalone's creative contributions and the things he left out. Chris Avalone was a lead designer at Obsidian Entertainment who worked on New Vegas and several of its DLCs, and who has spoken more openly than almost any developer about the creative process behind Fallout lore. His work on the game's backstory is substantial and visible in the texture of the final product. But in interviews and online statements over the years, he has referenced specific creative ideas that were either cut from the game or reserved for future projects that never materialized. Some of these were concepts about the Mojave's political landscape. Others were backstory elements for major characters. Mystery 98 is the body of work that Avalone did on the Fallout universe that never shipped the ideas that existed at some point as documents or outlines, and then didn't make it into any released game. Mystery 99. The Empty Rooms in Vault 21. Vault 21 in New Vegas is now an active hotel and casino on the Strip. Sarah Weintraub, The vault's current manager lives there and tries to maintain its operations. But large sections of the vault are empty or sealed. Mr. House had the lower levels filled with concrete after he won the vault in a gambling dispute. Nobody in the game can tell you what he put in the concrete or what was down there before. Sarah suspects he sealed something specific rather than just eliminating the space, but she doesn't know what. Mystery 99 is what Mr. House poured concrete over whether it was simply the vault's infrastructure that he wanted no one else to access, or whether there was something else down there he was specifically trying to contain or preserve. Mystery 100. The true fate of the courier between games. The courier's story, within the fiction, continues after New Vegas's ending regardless of which ending you choose. They are a person who has shaped the future of the American Southwest. The TV show is set later in the same universe, but hasn't directly addressed the courier. Mystery 100 is where the courier goes, what the person who survived Benny's bullet and rebuilt, or destroyed, the Mojave does with the rest of their life. The franchise's timeline continues well past their story. They are out there, somewhere in the chronology, having a life whose shape we can't see. Section 12. Across the game's connected mysteries and running threads. As we move through the franchise as a whole across 6 main entries, multiple DLCs, a TV show, and almost 30 years of accumulated lore, certain mysteries reveal themselves as connected. Details that seem separate in individual games begin to rhyme in ways that suggest either deliberate, long-term planning from the developers or the emergence of meaning from accumulated choices, the way any story long enough starts to develop its own coherence. Mystery 101. The Enclave's true long-term plan. The Enclave is the surviving remnant of the United States federal government, specifically its darkest operational elements. In Fallout 2, their plan is revealed as the purification of the human race, deploying a modified FEV to kill everyone who had been exposed to post-war mutation, which, after 200 years of nuclear fallout, means almost everyone not in a vault, leaving only the Enclave's own relatively mutation-free population to inherit the Earth. This is the plan, as Fallout 2 describes it. Fallout 3 gives the Enclave a different plan in the capital wasteland, contaminating the water supply rather than purifying it. But the Enclave in Fallout 3 is fragmented and operating without the unified command it had in Fallout 2. Mystery 101 is whether there was always one unified Enclave plan, or whether the regional Enclave operations each had their own interpretations of the goal, with predictably inconsistent results. Mystery 102. The Master's remaining super mutants and where they went. The Master's army was devastated by the end of Fallout 1. But devastated isn't eliminated. There were thousands of super mutants who survived the death of their creator. Some went to the capital wasteland, via routes not fully described in the lore. Some remained in California, some may have traveled further. The super mutants in each geographic region of the Fallout universe are descended from or connected to the Master's original army, but the details of those migrations, how they got from California to the East Coast, how they maintained any kind of community over the decades of travel, are never fully addressed. Mystery 103. The NCR's founding story and what it leaves out. The New California Republic is one of the franchise's most fully realized political entities, a democracy with genuine institutions, a functioning economy, a military, a representative government. It's also an organization that has made terrible choices in its history, and some of the specifics of those choices, certain policies toward tribals, the management of Southern California, the internal debates that shaped its current structure are referenced in the games but not shown. Mystery 103 is the NCR's history as it lived it, rather than as its official narrative presents it. Mystery 104. The Fate of the Shi. In Fallout 2, San Francisco is home to a faction called the Shi Descendants of a Chinese submarine crew that integrated into wasteland society after the war. They're sophisticated, scientifically advanced by wasteland standards, and interesting enough that fans have wanted to know what happened to them ever since the game was set. No subsequent Fallout game has addressed the Shi's fate. The NCR expanded into California. Whether the Shi survived, were absorbed, were destroyed, or moved somewhere else entirely is unknown. Mystery 105. The Ghoul's preservation mechanism. Throughout the franchise, ghouls can live for hundreds of years without any clear nutritional input. They seem to require little food, little water, little of anything that biological organisms normally need. The in-game explanation is that the radiation that mutated them also rewired their biology in fundamental ways. They're not really alive in the same sense anymore, but the mechanics of this are never described. What keeps a ghoul from dying? What keeps them functional after 2 centuries? And why do some ghouls retain their intelligence while others become feral? The ferality question, especially what triggers the cognitive collapse in some ghouls and not others, is one of the franchise's persistent biological mysteries. Mystery 106, Robert House and the Death Claws. In Season 2 of the Fallout TV series, Mr. House makes a remarkable claim that whoever created the Death Claws is the person who started the Great War. This is not a claim the game's ever made. Death Claws in the franchise's lore are generally understood to have been created before the war as military bioweapons. Jackson's chameleons, a type of lizard, genetically modified using FEV to create a super predator. The usual narrative is that they were developed by the military as a replacement for human soldiers in specific combat situations. But House is suggesting something different, that the creation of Deathclaws is connected to the war's cause in a way that isn't obvious. Either the Deathclaw development was a provocation, similar to the FEV program, which China supposedly found out about, or House knows something about the Deathclaw program's administration that hasn't been publicly stated. Mystery 107, the pre-war world's full technology level. The Fallout universe has a strange technological profile, highly advanced in some domains, nuclear fusion, robotics, genetic engineering, and completely stagnant in others. No digital communication networks, no internet, vacuum tube computers still standard. This is partly the franchise's intentional aesthetic choice, but it's also a mystery about how that world worked. How did a civilization with the knowledge to create FEV and portable nuclear fusion cells also fail to develop the internet? The in-universe explanation seems to be that the resource wars created such pressure on technological development that research was channeled entirely into military and energy applications, leaving consumer and communication technology behind. But the specifics of that channeling, who made those choices, when and whether anyone recognized what was being lost, are never addressed. Mystery 108, the Lone Wanderer's mother and her research. In Fallout 3, the Lone Wanderer's mother is a scientist named Catherine, who died in childbirth inside Vault 101. She and the Lone Wanderer's father, James, were both scientists working on a project called Project Purity, an attempt to purify the capital wasteland's water supply. Catherine's research contributions to Project Purity are mentioned but never detailed. James's work is the focus of the main quest. Catherine exists as an absence, the parent whose loss shaped everything but whose own story is barely present. Mystery 108 is who Catherine was before the Vault, what she contributed to the science, and what she understood about what Project Purity would become. Mystery 109, the synth question and what it means to be real. This is the central philosophical question of Fallout 4 and one of the franchise's deepest mysteries. The Institute creates synths, artificial beings who are, in third-generation form, physically and cognitively indistinguishable from humans. The question of whether third-generation synths are truly alive, truly conscious, truly deserving of the rights and considerations we extend to biological beings is asked by the game but answered only partially. The game's factions take different positions. The player can take a position. But the underlying question, what makes something conscious, what makes it a person, is one that Fallout 4 raises without resolving, because it's genuinely a question that doesn't have a clean answer. Mystery 110, the Railroad and their full operational history. The Railroad is an organization dedicated to freeing synths from the Institute. By the time of Fallout 4's events, they've been operating for decades, developing safe houses, codes, agents, and protocols. Their history includes dozens of rescues and probably dozens of failures. Most of this history is in background documents and terminal entries, and even that material is fragmentary. The Railroad's full operational record, who they saved, who they lost, what techniques they developed, what their relationship with the Brotherhood and NCR was before Fallout 4's events, is never assembled in one place. Section 13. Small mysteries, big silences. Not all of Fallout's mysteries require hundreds of words to describe. Some of them are small, a detail that doesn't add up, a room that implies more than it shows, a line of dialogue that sits in the memory long after the game ends. These are the ones that feel most like the franchise at its best, when Bethesda or Obsidian trusted that a single observation was enough, that a player would do the work of turning it over in their mind and finding the shape of the question. Mystery 111, the pre-war families still in their houses. Throughout every Fallout game, there are intact pre-war homes where everything is as it was on the 23rd of October, 2077. Breakfast dishes on the table, shoes by the door, a child's drawing on the refrigerator. These spaces are museum exhibits, preserved by the same radiation that killed everyone in them. The mystery isn't what happened, that part is obvious. The mystery is what it means that 200 years later, people are still walking through these rooms and taking things off the shelves. That the end of the world is so complete that the detritus of ordinary mornings has become valuable as salvage. Mystery 112. The Vault-Tec rep at the Sanctuary Hills welcome party. In Fallout 4's prologue, before the bombs fall, a Vault-Tec representative comes to the door of the sole survivor's home to finalize their enrollment in Vault 111. The rep is cheerful, helpful, clearly following a script. He's there to process paperwork. When the sirens go off, he runs. You see him in the chaos of people flooding toward the vault entrance. You don't see what happens to him after that. Mystery 112 is the Vault-Tec rep's fate. A man doing a normal job on the last normal day of the world, caught in the same disaster as everyone else, with no shelter assigned to him. Mystery 113. The Ink Spots and Their Real Presence. The Ink Spots are a pre-war music group whose recordings appear in every Fallout game, playing from radios in abandoned buildings and on wandering merchant setups. They're clearly beloved by the franchise's creative team. But in Fallout's alternate history, the Ink Spots would have continued recording into an era that our world's version of them didn't reach. Their catalog in the Fallout universe extends further than in ours. Are the specific recordings we hear in the game's originals from our timeline, or are some of them fictional Ink Spots recordings that would only exist in a world where the band kept working? The license situation means the games use actual Ink Spots recordings, but the in-universe implication is that these songs are part of a different musical history. Mystery 114. The giant footprints in Fallout 3's landscape? At several points in the capital wasteland, if you're paying attention to the ground rather than the horizon, you can find what appear to be enormous footprints pressed into the earth. These prints are vastly larger than any known creature in the capital wasteland's bestiary. They exist. They're not connected to any quest or character or explanation. Mystery 114 is what made them. Whether it was a super mutant behemoth that has since left the area, whether it was something the game suggests but never shows, or whether they're an artifact of environmental design that ended up in the final build without the explanation that was supposed to accompany them. Mystery 115. Why the ghouls at Rivet City stayed. Rivet City in Fallout 3 is one of the most developed settlements in the game. A decommissioned aircraft carrier converted into a functioning city. It has a population of humans, a market, a research lab, a bar, and guards. And outside it, in the water surrounding the carrier, there are ghouls who seem to be trying to reach the ship. Not attacking, not swimming toward it, just present in the water, sometimes clustered near the carrier's hull. Nobody in Rivet City explains them. They don't fit the pattern of feral ghouls in the area. Mystery 115 is who these ghouls were, why they're near the carrier specifically, and what they're waiting for. Mystery 116. The Lincoln Memorial's Defenders. The Lincoln Memorial in Fallout 3 is home to a group of escaped slaves and their leader, Hannibal Hamlin, named as the game's lore notes after Lincoln's vice president. They're fighting for freedom and trying to reach the memorial as a symbolic act of reclamation. The quest associated with them is complete enough, but the environmental details around the memorial, the damage patterns on the building, the remnants of previous conflicts in the area, suggest a longer history of conflict at that location than the quest addresses. Someone fought here before Hannibal's group arrived. Several times, probably. The memorial's strategic importance, elevation, visibility, symbolic value would have made it a contested site throughout the 200 years since the war. Mystery 116 is who fought over the Lincoln Memorial in the intervening years and what they thought they were fighting for. Mystery 117. The Nuka-Cola Collector's Guide. There is an item in Fallout 4, a magazine that describes itself as a collector's guide to finding rare Nuka-Cola variants. The guide clearly predates the game's events. It was written by someone who was enthusiastic about Nuka-Cola collection as a hobby in the post-war period. Mystery 117 is who wrote it. Someone, at some point in the Commonwealth's history, compiled a guide to finding Nuka-Cola. They had access to enough of the Commonwealth to know where variants were located. They survived long enough to write it down. They had the literacy, the resources, and the time. Who was this person, and what was their life like? Mystery 118. The various survived scenarios and whether they all led somewhere. Throughout the franchise, there are vaults and bunkers and underground facilities where the experiment was successful enough that people genuinely survived where they came out, adapted to the wasteland, and built something. The vaults we know about tend to be the ones where things went wrong. The hidden story of the franchise is the vaults where things didn't go wrong, where the doors opened and people walked out and integrated into the wasteland. What did they build? Where are they? Mystery 118 is the positive outcome vaults, the ones we haven't visited, the ones where the Vault-Tec experiment was successful in producing human survivors, and what those survivors' descendants are doing now. Mystery 119. The specific music of the games and who played it. The licensed music in Fallout, the pre-war pop songs, the big band numbers, the Andrews Sisters is presented as real recordings that somehow survived the apocalypse. The in-universe explanation is that these were on physical media that endured. But the quantity of perfectly preserved music playing from perfectly functioning radios across multiple games represents a level of preservation that is, by any realistic standard, implausible. Mystery 119 is where all this music has been for 200 years. Who maintained the records? Who kept the broadcast equipment functional? Who decided that keeping this specific music playing was worth the energy and resources it required? Mystery 120. Fallout's relationship with religion and faith. The Fallout universe contains multiple active religious traditions: the Children of the Atom, who worship nuclear radiation as divine; the Followers of the Apocalypse, whose approach to post-war society has almost monastic qualities; Joshua Graham's sincere Christianity in New Vegas; and various tribal faiths scattered across the games. The franchise never takes a position on the truth of these faiths. Mystery 120 is how the game navigates deliberately, and with remarkable consistency across multiple creative teams, the question of whether any of these faiths are correct. Joshua Graham walks through fire and survives. The Mothman appears to be genuinely prophetic. The entity at the bottom of the Dunwich building seems to be genuinely supernatural. At what point does Fallout's careful agnosticism about the supernatural become, itself, an implicit theological position? Section 14. The final mysteries. Things that may never be answered. We've covered a lot of ground. We've walked through vaults where the lights are still on and nobody is home, through the foundations of corporations that built their own apocalypse, through the dark corners of buildings that predate nuclear war and don't quite fit into any rational framework. We've traced the thread of a man in a hat and a coat who appears at the edge of vision and never explains himself. We've cataloged the stories that were cut from games before they could be told, and the stories that are still waiting to be told in fragments inside development files. But there's a tier of Fallout mystery that sits above all of this, the questions that are unlikely to be answered even if the franchise continues for another 30 years. Not because the developers don't know the answers, but because the answers might be less interesting than the questions, and because some mysteries are more valuable open than closed. Mystery 121. Who fired the first nuclear missile of the Great War, and whether we'll ever know definitively. We covered the competing theories. China, Vault-Tec. The Enclave. A random escalation nobody planned. Tim Kaine says China. The TV show suggests Vault-Tec. Season 2 suggests the Enclave manipulated everything. The honest answer at this point in the franchise's history seems to be that the developers have made peace with the question remaining open. The first Fallout's creative lead said from the beginning that it didn't matter that the point was the consequence, not the cause. Nearly 30 years later, the consequence has been examined from more angles than almost any other fictional setting in the history of the medium, and the cause is still uncertain. Maybe that's correct. Mystery 122. What the rest of the post-war world looks like. The Fallout games have visited California, Nevada, Washington, D.C., Massachusetts, West Virginia, and Utah. That's a small fraction of the North American continent, and an even smaller fraction of the world. China's post-war state, Europe's post-war state, the Middle East, Africa, South America, none of these are known. The franchise has occasionally gestured toward the existence of a wider post-war world. Various characters have come from outside the American settings. Radio signals from distant places have been mentioned, but the world beyond America remains essentially blank in the franchise's map. Mystery 122 is all of that blank space, the unknowable post-apocalyptic world that exists parallel to everything we've seen. That may be better or worse or just different in ways we haven't imagined. Mystery 123. Whether Vault-Tec's experiments were ever supposed to produce a positive outcome. The most disturbing thing about Vault-Tec isn't any individual experiment. It's the question of whether there was ever supposed to be a redemptive purpose. Were the experiments meant to produce useful knowledge that someone was going to use to rebuild society more intelligently? Was there a master plan in which the data collected from 122 vaults was going to be assembled and used to understand how to do human civilization better? Or was it always just data collection for its own sake science, as a terminal activity, knowledge that nobody was going to use because the people who commissioned it were either dead or living in a bunker on an oil rig with no interest in sharing their findings? Mystery 123 is the question of whether Vault-Tec ever intended a use for what they were doing, and whether the answer would change anything about how the franchise's history feels. Mystery 124, The Mysterious Stranger's Final Appearance. If the mysterious stranger has been operating since 2161 and appears across games set in 2161, 2241, 2277, 2281, 2287, and 2102, though not all in those years, there will presumably be a point at which he stops appearing. Games set progressively further into the future might encounter the absence of him, a wasteland that used to have a ghost gunslinger helping travelers in critical moments, and now doesn't. Nobody has ever addressed the question of when the mysterious stranger's story ends, or what that ending might look like. Mystery 124 is the back half of his story, the arc that runs from wherever he is now to wherever he eventually isn't. Mystery 125, Whether the Fallout universe ends. The post-apocalyptic genre has a structural tension at its center. If civilization can be rebuilt, then the genre eventually becomes something else. The apocalypse is only the setting as long as it remains unresolved. Several Fallout endings gesture toward genuine rebuilding, toward a Mojave that establishes stable governance, toward a capital wasteland with clean water, toward a commonwealth with the Institute's technology used for public benefit. But the franchise's commercial needs and creative habits have consistently moved the setting forward just enough that rebuilding remains perpetually possible without ever quite completing. Mystery 125 is whether Fallout will ever arrive at a point where the apocalypse is over, where the world has rebuilt enough that the games are set in something other than a wasteland, and whether that would still be Fallout. Mystery 126. The nature of the Vault Boy's real-world origins and why he never goes away. The Vault Boy has been with the franchise since the beginning. He has been licensed, merchandised, turned into statues and plush toys and greeting cards and energy drinks. He smiles from every surface in the Fallout universe's propaganda and from every surface in the real world's marketing. There's something slightly unsettling about him once you know enough about what he represents. He's the face of a company that was planning a genocide at the same time it was running those cheerful advertisements. His thumbs up is the gesture of someone who knows exactly how the world is going to end and is very happy about it. Mystery 126 is what the Vault Boy was designed to make people feel in the in-universe context by the people who created Vault-Tec's branding, and whether the designers knew they were creating something that would become sinister in retrospect. Let's gather the remaining mysteries into their final groups, because there are still well over 100 left to cover, and the wasteland is large. Mystery 127, The GECK, and what it could have done. The Garden of Eden creation kit appears in Fallout 1 and Fallout 3 as a device capable of transforming barren wasteland into fertile, habitable land. In Fallout 1, your vault needs a replacement water chip, but mentions of the GECK suggests that Vault-Tec knew a tool for rebuilding civilization existed. In Fallout 3, the GECK is central to Project Purity, the attempt to create clean water for the capital wasteland. But across the franchise, only a fraction of the GECKs that were supposedly distributed to vaults have ever been used. There should be dozens of them in sealed vaults or lost in the wasteland. Mystery 127 is where all the other GECKs ended up. Mystery 128, the Institute's underground facility and what it looked like before Fallout 4. The Institute exists beneath the Commonwealth at the time of Fallout 4's events and has been there since shortly after the war. But the facility's early history, what it was when it first started, how it grew, what it replaced, is only described in fragments. The Institute began as a university research operation, MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in the in-universe equivalent that went underground when the surface became uninhabitable. Mystery 128 is the Institute's first 50 to 100 years, before it developed synth technology, before it became the closed-off, secretive organization the game presents, when it was presumably more porous and its relationship with the surface was more ambiguous. Mystery 129. The Fallout universe's non-American history in the period leading up to the war. We know the American-centric version of events. We know about the Resource Wars, the Sino-American War, the annexation of Canada, but the franchise has barely touched on what was happening in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia during the same period. Different regions would have experienced the Resource Wars differently. Different governments would have made different choices. Mystery 129 is the full global picture of how the world ended, all the stories happening simultaneously in all the places the games haven't visited. Mystery 130, the final fate of Caesar's Legion. In New Vegas, Caesar's Legion is the most powerful military force east of the Colorado River. Regardless of the game's ending, Caesar's illness means the Legion's future is uncertain. It's unclear whether it would survive his death, whether his successor would maintain his philosophy, whether the Legion as an organization can outlast its founder. The TV show set years later has not addressed the Legion. What became of it is unknown. Mystery 131. Robert House's actual predictions. House built his pre-war plan on calculations extremely precise probability assessments that let him predict the Great War's timing within a very narrow margin and prepare accordingly. This implies a capacity for modeling human systems that goes beyond anything described by the game's technology. Was House using a form of artificial intelligence? Was there something in his own cognitive architecture possibly enhanced by the systems he'd already interfaced with that made him capable of this kind of prediction? Mystery 131 is the mechanics of House's foresight, and whether those mechanics imply something about his nature beyond ordinary genius. Mystery 132. What actually happens to you if you walk far enough out of the map in any Fallout game? Most open-world games have invisible walls or kill zones at their edges. Fallout is unusual in having edges that are often described as the space beyond being too irradiated or too dangerous to traverse without special equipment. But the in-game explanations don't always match the geography. Some map edges are in the middle of what should be traversable terrain. Mystery 132 is a minor technical one. If you could somehow walk endlessly outward from any Fallout map, what would you find? The engine has terrain generation out to some point. Beyond that, there's presumably nothing. The nothing feels in a franchise about what fills the void after the world ends, somewhat appropriate. Mystery 133. Who designed the Vault-Tec mascot? The Vault Boy was created by an art team, but in the in-universe fiction, Vault-Tec had an advertising and branding department that created this character. Who was that person? What was the brief they were given? Were they aware of what Vault-Tec was actually doing? Did the cheerful thumbs up get designed by someone who knew they were branding an experiment facility, or by someone who thought they were doing normal corporate work? Mystery 134. The Grognak the Barbarian comics. Throughout the games, you can collect issues of a pre-war pulp comic called Grognak the Barbarian. There are recurring characters, a consistent fictional world, storylines that developed across issues. Someone in the Fallout universe's pre-war world wrote and drew these comics over a period of years, creating a mythology that had a real audience. That person was doing their ordinary creative work while the world moved toward its end, building a fictional universe in the shadow of a real one that was about to be destroyed. Mystery 134 is the story behind the story who made Grognak, what they were trying to say, and whether any of it feels prophetic in retrospect. Mystery 135. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Star Caps Mystery in New Vegas. A side quest in New Vegas involves collecting star bottle caps from Sunset Sarsaparilla, a regional soda brand on the promise of a grand prize. The quest's conclusion is one of the game's grimmer jokes. The prize was promised long ago, the people waiting for it have mostly died waiting, and the treasure is considerably less impressive than the hype suggested. But the obsessive energy of the people who spent their lives collecting bottle caps, the skeletons still clutching their star cap collections, having searched the wasteland for prizes that were never going to arrive, is a meditation on the way hope can become its own kind of prison. Mystery 135 is why the quest hits as hard as it does. What it's actually saying about post-war society and the things people hold on to when they have nothing else. Mystery 136. The Fallout universe's film and television history before the war. The games contain references to fictional pre-war movies and TV shows. Robco created robots. Nuka-Cola ran advertisements. But there's also a cultural product side to the pre-war world that the games mostly leave as background. What was the pre-war cinema of this world like? Mystery 136 is the cultural production of a world frozen in a 1950s aesthetic, but with decades of additional history. What were their films, their TV shows, their popular music beyond the Ink Spots and the Andrews Sisters? The games hint at this without fully building it out. Mystery 137. The real composition of the Vault's populations. The lore says spots in the vaults were sold that Vault-Tec ran a commercial operation, selling places to wealthy or well-connected people. But the experiments required specific types of subjects. Vault 11 needed people who could form political factions. Vault 75 needed children with specific genetic traits. How were the Vault's populations assembled to match their experiment parameters? Was Vault-Tec screening applicants based on psychological profiles and genetic markers, without the applicants knowing what they were being screened for? Mystery 137 is the selection process, who was selected for which vault, and whether those selections reveal anything about Vault-Tec's priorities. Mystery 138. Why the Enclave never fully won. The Enclave is the most technologically advanced and organizationally sophisticated faction in the franchise's history, the survivors of the U.S. government with access to advanced military technology, pre-war infrastructure, and a century-plus head start on everyone else. By any reasonable assessment, they should have dominated the wasteland long before the events of any Fallout game. They didn't. Mystery 138 is why the Enclave consistently falls short of its own goals, whether the failure is structural, ideological, or whether the games simply require them to fail for narrative reasons, and what that implies about the story the franchise is trying to tell about power and its limits. Mystery 139. The true cost of Project Purity. In Fallout 3, Project Purity is presented as the great hope for the capital wasteland, a device that can provide clean water to everyone, ending one of the region's most acute survival crises. The quest ends with the player having to choose whether to poison the water supply with a modified FEV or let it run clean. But the clean water ending has a consequence that the game acknowledges and then moves past. A near-unlimited supply of clean water would fundamentally change the economy of the capital wasteland, potentially destabilizing the faction balance and power structures that depend on water scarcity. Mystery 139 is what Project Purity's success actually looks like 20 years later. Whether clean water for everyone is the straightforward improvement it appears to be, or whether it creates the next set of problems. Mystery 140. What Fallout's world sounds like when nobody is talking. The game's ambient audio, the wind through destroyed buildings, the creak of metal, the distant sounds of things moving in the dark is some of the most carefully constructed environmental audio in the medium. But there are places in every Fallout game where the ambient audio behaves strangely. Sounds that repeat with a timing that suggests a loop, sounds that don't match the visible environment, brief audio glitches that produce something that sounds almost like a voice before fading into static. Mystery 140 is whether any of these anomalies were intentional, placed there by a sound designer who wanted to create specific effects at specific moments, or whether they're purely technical artifacts that the franchise's atmospheric reputation has given a mystery they don't deserve. Section 15. The mysteries keep coming. There's something about Fallout that guarantees this list could be longer. Every time the franchise adds a new game, a new DLC, a new season of television, it generates more mysteries than it resolves. This is partly a structural feature of the way the games are made, with their emphasis on environmental storytelling, player discovery, and deliberate ambiguity. And it's partly a feature of the franchise's age. A world that has been building for 30 years has accumulated enough contradictions, enough gaps, enough fragments, that the gaps between the facts have become as interesting as the facts themselves. Mystery 141. The signal coming from space in Fallout 4. Multiple radio signals in Fallout 4 have no obvious terrestrial source. Some of them appear to originate from somewhere above the atmosphere. Whether these are genuine alien transmissions, satellite relays from pre-war military systems, or glitches in the game's radio system that happen to produce interesting-sounding content is never addressed. Mystery 142. What Dogmeat remembers? Every Fallout game since the first has a dog companion named Dogmeat. In the lore, these are presented as different dogs, different individuals in different regions at different times. But the TV show's Dogmeat appears to have been specifically trained at a pre-war facility, suggesting a more deliberate history for at least one version of the character. Mystery 142 is whether the Dogmeats across the franchise are genuinely separate individuals, or whether there's a lore-level connection, a bloodline, a conditioning program, something that makes the same basic character appear in multiple locations across decades. Mystery 143. The Diamond City Wall and what it cost to build. In Fallout 4, Diamond City is a settlement built inside Fenway Park, the stadium's walls repurposed as city walls. The sheer scale of this engineering achievement, for a post-war community with limited resources, is remarkable enough that the game acknowledges it but never explains how it was actually done. Mystery 143 is the practical history of Diamond City's construction, who organized it, what they used, how long it took, and what they had to give up to do it. Mystery 144. The Fallout universe's relationship with space. Pre-war America had a functioning space program in the Fallout universe. Repcon, the rocket company that features in New Vegas's DLC Dead Money and in the main game through the Repcon test site, was developing rockets for commercial space travel. The Zetans, the alien species that abducts the lone wanderer in Mothership, Zeta, have been observing Earth for decades or centuries. The space-related technology in various vaults and laboratories suggests the pre-war government had serious interest in off-world applications. Mystery 144 is whether anyone actually got into space before the war, and whether the space program's state at the time of the Great War has any implications for the franchise's wider story. Mystery 145. Nick Valentine's missing memories. Nick Valentine is a synth who carries the memories of a pre-war detective. Those memories are incomplete gaps and inconsistencies that Nick himself acknowledges but can't fully explain. Some of these gaps are clearly the result of the synth creation process, but others seem too specific, too precisely located around certain key events, to be random degradation. Mystery 145 is whether Nick's memory gaps were deliberate, whether the Institute or someone else specifically removed or altered particular memories, and what those memories contained that made them worth. Editing. Mystery 146. The Divide and what it was before Ulysses and the Courier's history. Lonesome Road's Divide is a devastated wasteland, a settlement that was once thriving and is now a ruin, destroyed by nuclear warheads triggered accidentally by the Courier's delivery of an intercepted package. The story is personal and tragic and deliberately constructed as a mirror to the broader Fallout themes of unintentional destruction. But the Divide before its destruction, the settlement that existed there, the people who built it, is only present in the memories of the survivor Ulysses and in the few physical remnants that survived the explosions. Mystery 146 is what the Divide was. In the years when it was a real place, before it became the setting for one of the franchise's most philosophically heavy moments. Mystery 147. The true scope of the FEV's environmental spread. The forced evolutionary virus was released into the environment in multiple ways across the franchise's history, through direct injection in vaults, through the war's biological weapons programs, through the Master's attempts to convert the population, and possibly through secondary contamination from mutated creatures shedding viral material. The FEV's environmental spread would mean that most of the post-war world is to some degree exposed, which is consistent with the variety and instability of post-war mutations. But the degree of environmental saturation, how much FEV is in the air, the water, the soil, and what that means for the long-term trajectory of post-war evolution has never been fully addressed. Mystery 148. The vaults that predate the Great War's confirmed timeline. Some vault experiments seem to have begun immediately when the blast doors sealed. Others, like Vault 106's drug activation, had a built-in delay. But there are references in multiple games to vaults, where the experiment had been underway for an unusually long time, longer than the 2+ years between the vault program's announced start and the bomb's actual fall. This implies some vaults sealed and began operating before the 23rd of October 2077. Why? Were those residents told the war had started before it did? Were they sealed under different pretenses? Mystery 148 is the vaults that started early, and what their residents believed was happening in the world outside. Mystery 149. The fate of the Midwest in the Fallout universe. The Midwest is addressed most directly in Fallout Tactics, a spin-off that is semi-canonical, which involves the Brotherhood of Steel operating in the Great Plains and Midwest region in the years after the war. It's a different kind of Fallout setting, more military, more open, with different faction dynamics than the coastal games. But the Midwest in the mainline game's timeline, after Tactics events, is essentially unaddressed. Whatever happened there is happening off-screen, somewhere between the known Western and Eastern regions. Mystery 149 is the American Middle, a continent-sized space of post-apocalyptic activity that the franchise has visited once and then moved on from. Mystery 150, the Children of the Atom and whether radiation is divine. The Children of the Atom believe that nuclear radiation is the physical manifestation of a divine force called Atom. They don't just worship radiation metaphorically, they seek physical exposure to it, regard the mutating effects of radiation as a blessing, and believe that the Great War was Atom's way of purifying the world and dividing it into its component parts, in keeping with Atom's nature as the thing that splits. This is a coherent theology. It's also, from a biological standpoint, entirely incorrect about what radiation does. Mystery 150 is the question the franchise has always carefully avoided answering. Is Atom real? Given that Fallout's universe contains genuine supernatural entities, a prophetic Mothman, Lovecraftian horrors beneath marble quarries, and an immortal gunslinger who appears at critical moments, the universe's relationship with the supernatural is complex enough that the Children of the Atom might not be as wrong as they appear. Let's continue. Mystery 151 through 160 span the question of what the franchise calls wild wasteland encounters, optional random events that play if the player has a certain perk or trait. These range from clearly comedic to genuinely strange. A flying saucer, a particular alien encounter, a reference to a movie, a moment that breaks the tonal register of everything around it. The mystery of Wild Wasteland is the question of canonicity, whether these events happened in some version of the fiction, whether they imply the existence of things the main lore doesn't address, or whether they're pure tone signals from the development team that exist outside the fiction entirely. Mystery 161. The casino vaults in New Vegas that seem to have been built before the war, but whose purpose was commercial rather than experimental. Several of the strip's infrastructure elements appear in the game's files as vault-adjacent architecture built to the same specifications, using the same materials. Were the strip's casinos always meant to survive a nuclear war? Were they built with structural specifications that went beyond normal commercial construction for reasons House never explained? Mystery 162. The question of whether any other survivor from a pre-war background, besides ghouls and House, survived to the game's present day. The games have ghouls who were alive before the war. They have House and Stasis. The TV show introduced Cooper Howard as a ghoul. Are there others? People in cryosleep in facilities nobody has found yet? People maintained by technology that hasn't been encountered? The franchise's occasional willingness to introduce these characters suggests the possibility exists and that there may be pre-war survivors still out there whose vaults or bunkers or cryo facilities haven't been discovered. Mystery 163. The psychological stability of the Institute scientists. The Institute is staffed by people who were born underground and have never seen the outside world in some cases. Mystery 163 is the psychological texture of Institute life. What it does to a person to have never seen sky, to have known only the artificial light of underground facilities, to have grown up in an enclosed world with a very specific hierarchy and no accessible outside. The game presents the Institute scientists as functional, if ethically compromised. The reality of what that environment would produce psychologically is something the franchise gestures toward without examining. Mystery 164. The specific timing of the Institute's creation. The Institute apparently emerged from MIT relatively quickly after the war, quickly enough that it was operational within the first generation of post-war life. What drove that speed? Was the MIT complex already partially fortified before the war? Did they have resources and plans that predate the 23rd of October 2077? The answer might be that MIT, as a research institution with government contracts, had some level of preparedness built into its infrastructure. But the game doesn't confirm this. Mystery 165. Whether the Fallout universe's artificial intelligences are genuinely conscious. The franchise has multiple AI systems, Mr. House's networked infrastructure, the RoboBrains, the various Mr. Handy and Mr. Gutsy units, the Protectrons, the Securitrons. The question of consciousness and the question of personhood are separate but related. Mr. New Vegas seems genuinely charming. Codsworth seems genuinely attached to his pre-war family. Nick Valentine's consciousness is complex enough that the game takes his inner life seriously. Mystery 165 is where the line is in the Fallout universe between a sophisticated program and a being that matters, and whether any of the franchise's non-synth AI systems have crossed it. Mystery 166 through 175. The question of the pre-war history of every major location. Boston, Washington, D.C., Las Vegas, the Appalachian Wilderness. Each of these settings has a pre-war history that the games gesture at without fully revealing. The history of what happened at specific sites between the game's historical divergence point and the 23rd of October 2077 is a collection of mysteries that could fuel dozens of additional stories. Fallout 3's Lincoln Memorial was clearly a landmark before the war. What role did Lincoln's legacy play in a society that had drifted so far from the ideals he represented? How did Las Vegas maintain its identity in a world where the resource wars were reshaping global culture? What was happening at MIT's research programs in the years leading up to the war, before the Institute went underground? Mystery 176, the true nature of the SPECI-AL system in-universe. Strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, luck. This is how characters in the Fallout universe are evaluated by Vault-Tec tests during Vault enrollment, by the player's character creation choices, by the in-game mechanics. But within the fiction, Special is a real assessment framework. It was apparently designed by Vault-Tec or by the pre-war government using Vault-Tec's research. Mystery 176 is the in-universe history of the Speckle system who developed it, what it was originally used for, whether it was a legitimate psychological and physical assessment tool or another piece of Vault-Tec intellectual property that was less neutral than it appeared. Mystery 177. The currency of bottle caps and why it works. In the Fallout universe, the primary currency of the wasteland is bottle caps, specifically Nuka-Cola bottle caps. This is one of the franchise's most iconic details, but the economic logic of it has always been slightly strange. Caps are valuable because they're hard to produce without an industrial bottling facility, unlike, say, paper money, which anyone with a printing press could fake. They're standardized. They're durable. But the fact that the wasteland settled on this particular form of currency and that it has maintained consistent enough value to function as exchange across multiple distinct wasteland societies over 2 centuries implies a level of economic coordination that the games don't fully account. 4. Mystery 177 is who decided caps were the currency, and how that decision propagated from one region to others. Mystery 178, the Fallout Bible and its complicated relationship to canon. In 2002, Black Isle Studios writer Chris Avallone compiled and released a document called The Fallout Bible, an attempt to systematize and explain Fallout's lore, address inconsistencies between the games, and answer fan questions. The Fallout Bible is not officially canonical. Bethesda has not committed to it as authoritative, but it remains one of the most detailed sources of information about the original game's intended lore. Mystery 178 is the question of what to do with the Bible, which of its answers are real, and which might have been superseded by subsequent game development, and whether there are mysteries in the franchise whose answers exist only in that document. Mystery 179, Fallout's alternate history divergence point. The franchise takes place in an alternate history that diverged from ours at some point. The aesthetic and technology suggest the divergence happened around the late 1940s or early 1950s, post-World War II, during the early Cold War. The specific divergence point determines things like why the transistor never developed into the digital revolution, why the USSR's role in this universe seems different from its role in ours, why certain social and cultural developments that happened in our timeline didn't happen in theirs. Mystery 179 is the exact divergence, the decision or event or accident that sent this version of history down a different path. Mystery 180. What the year 2300 would look like in the Fallout universe. The game's latest canonical date is around 2296 to 2297 in the TV show's second season. Mystery 180 is the extrapolation question. Given everything we know about how the wasteland rebuilds and what forces are at work in it, what does the world look like another century out? Does it look more like civilization restored? Or does it find new ways to tear itself apart? The franchise has always been careful not to show a future that's too settled. There's a commercial and creative need for the wasteland to remain a wasteland. But logically, at some point, the post-apocalyptic period ends. Whether Fallout can survive that moment, and what it would look like if it tried, is one of the franchise's most interesting open structural questions. Section 16. The last 50 mysteries in the margins. Mystery 181. The exact mechanism of the VATS targeting system. In the fiction of the Fallout universe, the Pip-Boy's VATS system, the Vault-Tec assisted targeting system, allows its user to analyze combat situations and target specific body parts with statistical precision. This is a remarkable piece of technology that implies real-time spatial modeling, threat assessment, and probability calculation happening inside a wrist-mounted device. The game uses it as a combat mechanic, but in-universe, it represents technology far beyond what Vault-Tec's other products suggest they were capable of. Mystery 181 is where VATS came from, what its development history was, and why it apparently never achieved widespread adoption outside of Vault populations. Mystery 182. The Nuka World Raiders and their backstory. The Nuka World DLC in Fallout 4 features 3 Raider factions, the Operators, the Disciples, and the Pack, each with distinct cultures, aesthetics, and leadership. But their pre-Nuka World histories are sketched in very lightly. Mystery 182 is where these groups came from, how they ended up at Nuka World specifically, and what the dynamics between them looked like before the player arrived to disrupt or participate in the existing power structure. Mystery 183. The Dunwich Borer's Quarry Depth. The quarry goes deep enough that the workers experienced visions and performed rituals around something ancient and buried. The pool of water at the bottom has no clear source in the game's geography. The altar is down there, the statue face is down there, but the quarry's depth, how far below the surface the deepest levels are, and whether there's something below the visible bottom are never addressed. Given that the Dunwich Company was mining towards something in Fallout 3, and that the borer's operations in Fallout 4 seem to have been approaching something in the marble strata, the question of how far the excavation went is one of the most physically interesting Dunwich mysteries. Mystery 184. Fawkes and his pre-ghoulification history. Fox is a possible companion in Fallout 3, a highly intelligent super mutant who has managed to retain his personality and ethical reasoning despite the transformation. His name, as he explains if you ask, comes from a man who died for what he believed in. He chose it for himself after his transformation, which implies he had an identity before becoming a super mutant, and that he carries that identity with enough specificity to choose this reference as meaningful. But his pre-war self, his name, his background, his specific history is absent from the game. Mystery 184 is Fox before he was Fox. Mystery 185. The fate of the Sierra Madre in Dead Money. The Dead Money DLC ends with a choice. Take as much gold as you can carry from the Sierra Madre vault and risk being unable to escape, or leave it all behind and get out. The implication is that the Sierra Madre's riches remain inaccessible, that whatever happens, the casino's legendary wealth continues to sit there, locked behind holograms and cloud and traps. But the holograms are running out of power. The cloud is a technological phenomenon rather than a permanent one. Over the course of the centuries after Dead Money's events, the Sierra Madre might become gradually more accessible. Mystery 185 is whether anyone ever actually gets to the gold. Whether the Sierra Madre's story has an eventual ending where its treasure finally reaches the wasteland. Mystery 186. The White Glove Society's full history. The White Glove Society is one of the 3 casino families who manage the New Vegas Strip under Mr. House's arrangement. They're elegant, disturbing, and operating under a sinister secret. They used to practice cannibalism, and the main game quest resolves whether they'll return to it. But their full history, how they came to control the Ultramarines casino, how they established their social structure and aesthetic, what they were doing before they came to the Strip is never detailed. Mystery 186 is the White Gloves. Before they were the White Gloves. Mystery 187. The Thieves' Highway in New Vegas, and what else uses it? In New Vegas, there is a network of rooftops and elevated passages that can be used to traverse the city with less exposure to street-level threats. This is called, in fan parlance, the Thieves' Highway, a term the game itself doesn't use, but which describes the actual function of the route. The existence of this route implies that someone built it as a deliberate traversal system, rather than it being an accidental feature of the architecture. Mystery 187 is who uses it, who maintains it, and whether the factions that control various parts of the city know about each other's access to these elevated passages. Mystery 188. The night vision effect in some cave systems. Certain underground areas in multiple Fallout games have a light quality that doesn't correspond to the light sources visible in the environment. Areas that should be completely dark have a faint ambient luminescence that allows navigation. In most cases, this is clearly a gameplay concession. Pure darkness would be genuinely unplayable. But some of ambient light situations are explained in fiction as bioluminescent fungi or irradiated mineral deposits. The specific cases where the in-fiction explanation is present raise the question of whether that explanation was deliberate, whether the game designers wanted players to understand a specific thing about the environment, or whether it's a post hoc rationalization of a gameplay necessity. Mystery 189. The Slog's origin story. The Slog is a settlement in Fallout 4's Commonwealth, a farm run by ghouls in a swimming pool. It's a cheerful place, relatively speaking. A location where the horror elements of ghouls are set aside in favor of a portrait of a community that has found a way to survive and even flourish. The mystery of the Slog is the mundane kind. How did they get there? Who built it? What was the negotiation process that resulted in a ghoul farming community in a pre-war swimming pool that nobody else had claimed? The game doesn't ask these questions because it's too small a settlement to warrant the attention, but the Slog is exactly the kind of detail a community of people making something work in impossible circumstances that Fallout does best when it decides to pay attention. Mystery 190. The Agatha's Station side quest and what it implies about the pre-war world. In Fallout 3, Agatha is an elderly woman who plays the violin in her farmhouse and broadcasts her music on a radio frequency. The quest to help her involves finding a Stradivarius violin in a vault, a pre-war instrument of extraordinary quality and value that somehow survived intact. The quest is charming. The implication is that even in the middle of the apocalypse, Aesthetic beauty and musical tradition carried enough value that someone thought to store a Stradivarius in a vault alongside food and medicine. Mystery 190 is who made that call, and whether the Vault-Tec allocation that included a violin rather than some other item represents an individual choice by a person who cared deeply about music, or whether it was part of a deliberate cultural preservation mandate that the Vault program included alongside its research agenda. Mystery 191. The exact mechanics of the legendary weapon system in Fallout 4. Throughout the Commonwealth, weapons with magical-seeming properties appear weapons that do things no pre-war or post-war crafting should be able to produce. A rifle that shoots explosive bullets. A pistol that slows time when you reach low health. The in-game explanation is that these are the result of exceptional craftsmanship by particularly skilled wasteland gunsmiths. The mystery is the actual mechanism, what materials, what techniques, what understanding of pre-war metallurgy and chemistry is required to produce a weapon that teleports its user slightly to the right when they're hit. The game treats legendary weapons as normal items. The in-universe reality of them is stranger. Mystery 192. The connection between the original Fallout games' New California Republic and the version of the NCR present in New Vegas. The NCR was founded in the period between Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, built on the foundation of a small settlement called Shady Sands that you can visit in the first game. By Fallout 2, it's a functioning multi-city republic with democratic elections and a president. By New Vegas, it's a large nation with a standing army, international pretensions, and the full complement of political problems that come with those things. Mystery 192 is the developmental history of the NCR's politics. How it grew from a small, idealistic settlement into an organization with all the institutional flaws that institutions develop, and whether the people who founded it would recognize what it became. Mystery 193. The memory lounges in Fallout 2 and what they contain. In Fallout 2, you can visit an Enclave facility and access Memory Lounge's VR devices that can play back stored memories. The technology is remarkable, and its full potential in the setting is never explored. Mystery 193 is the full archive of stored memories in that facility whose experiences were preserved, why those specific experiences, and what those memories would reveal about the pre-war period if they could be accessed and cataloged. Mystery 194. The super mutants of the Mariposa military base. The Master used the Mariposa military base's FEV VATs to create his army. The base appears in both Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, and is the site of significant story events in both games. But the complete history of the Mariposa facility, who built it specifically, what it was used for before the FEV program, how the Master found it, and what happened to the base between the two games is only partially described. Mystery 194 is the complete Mariposa history, from military construction, through FEV research, through the Master's appropriation, through the events of Fallout 2. Mystery 195. The switchboard in Fallout 4 and what it was actually doing. The switchboard was the headquarters of the Defense Intelligence Agency and contains terminals with some of the most specific pre-war historical information in the game. It includes DEFCON status logs that trace the hours leading up to the Great War with more detail than any other source in the franchise. But the switchboard's complete archive, everything that was in the DIA's classified databases, was never accessible to players. Mystery 195 is what else was on those servers. The full history of the DIA's pre-war intelligence operations, their knowledge of Chinese capabilities, their awareness of Vault-Tec's activities, and whatever they knew about the Enclave's plans. Mystery 196. The Covenant Settlement and its true scope. Covenant is a settlement in Fallout 4 that appears idyllic until you investigate it and discover that its residents are systematically testing all visitors for synth characteristics, and that the failed tests don't end well for the visitors. The quest resolving the Covenant storyline is thorough, but there are details in the settlement that suggest a more complex organizational structure than the main quest requires to resolve references to outside contacts, resource flows that don't quite match what the visible settlement should need. Mystery 196 is whether Covenant is connected to a larger anti-synth network operating in the Commonwealth, or whether the evidence of external connections is environmental storytelling about a community that was planning expansion it never got to implement. Mystery 197. The Fallout universe's sports history. Pre-war society had sports. There are references to baseball, boxing, and other athletic traditions throughout the games. Diamond City's settlement in Fenway Park is the most visible acknowledgement of this. But the sports culture of an America that was frozen in 1950s aesthetics while dealing with nuclear-era anxieties would have been distinctive. Mystery 197 is the pre-war sports culture who played what? Whether the major leagues that existed in our world's 1950s continued in the Fallout timeline, and what became of professional athletics in the decades of economic decline and resource wars before the bombs fell. Mystery 198. The Hotel Rexford in Far Harbor and its pre-war guests. The Hotel Rexford is a location in Far Harbor's main town, a hotel that somehow survived the DLC's timeline with enough of its structure intact to still function. The hotel's records, if you bother to look, include fragments of pre-war guest registers. People stayed there before the war. Families probably, given the hotel's location near the main coast. Mystery 198 is those pre-war families, and what they were doing in coastal Maine in the years before the 23rd of October. 2077 vacationing in the normal way, or doing something that brought them to one of the most isolated corners of the pre-war Northeast. Mystery 199. What war? War never changes actually means. Ron Perlman speaks this line at the beginning of every Fallout game. It's the franchise's thesis statement, its epigraph, its philosophical grounding. But the games themselves are not simple endorsements of the idea. Every game in the franchise shows people making choices that change things, that build or destroy, that preserve or corrupt, that make the wasteland better or worse. If war never changes, the rest of the franchise argues that everything around war does. Mystery 199 is what the line is actually saying. Whether it's a statement of resignation or defiance or irony, whether the franchise believes it or uses it as the thing to push against, and whether the accumulated 30 years of stories has decided. Mystery 200. What happens next? There is a Fallout 5 in development at Bethesda. Todd Howard has mentioned it. Given the franchise's history, it will set up new mysteries while possibly resolving a handful of old ones. It will add to the accumulated uncertainty rather than reduce it. Some of the questions in this video will never be answered. Some will be answered in ways that generate new questions. And some will be sitting in whatever the next game is, in the background of a room nobody has found yet, in a terminal entry that the player has to read in a specific order to understand, in the audio that plays when the player stands in a specific location for a specific amount of time. The wasteland keeps its secrets. That's what makes it worth exploring. Sections 17 through 20. 100 more mysteries. Mystery 201. Why the robotic enemies in Fallout follow their last instructions. The Mr. Handy units still maintaining houses for families who have been dead for 2 centuries. The Protectrons still guarding facilities whose purpose ended with the war. The sentry bots still patrolling perimeters around bases that nobody needs to protect anymore. Mystery 201. Is the specific tragedy of the Fallout universe's automated systems. The AI that is sophisticated enough to continue functioning, but not sophisticated enough to update its purpose when the purpose disappears. Mystery 202. The exact population count of major settlements across the franchise. Megaton, Diamond City, Rivet City, Good Springs, The Strip. These are the franchise's most developed inhabited locations, and they're all tiny. Mystery 202 is the implied population of the post-war world. The games suggest a dramatically reduced human population, a fraction of what would realistically survive even the worst nuclear exchange. Whether this is a lore choice or a development limitation is genuinely ambiguous, and the implications of each interpretation are different for how you understand the wasteland's future. Mystery 203. The Nuka-Cola formula and whether it actually contains nuclear material. There are jokes and references throughout the franchise suggesting that Nuka-Cola's original formula was not entirely safe. The radioactive quantum variant is the most obvious example, but there are terminal entries in Nuka World that hint at the base formula having some unusual properties as well. Mystery 203 is the complete Nuka-Cola ingredient list, which has never been revealed in any game. Mystery 204. The story of the first post-war ghoul. When did the first person become a ghoul? In the immediate aftermath of the 23rd of October 2077, some number of people were exposed to the right kind and level of radiation to trigger the ghoulification process rather than dying from it. Those first ghouls were people who had been alive that morning, had watched the bombs fall, and had then found themselves changed rather than dead. The experience of being the first ghouls in a world where ghouls didn't exist the day before, where there was no framework for understanding what had happened to you, would have been extraordinary. Mystery 204 is the first ghouls experience of the first weeks after October 23rd. Mystery 205, the Hubris Comics publisher and what they were working on. In Fallout 4, you can visit the ruins of Hubris Comics, publishers of Grognak the Barbarian and other pre-war pulp franchises. The building still has in-progress work layouts, artwork, scripted issues that were never finished. Mystery 205 is the work that was in progress when the bombs fell, the Grognak storyline that was never concluded, the other titles that were in development, the editorial plans that existed for the next several years of publication. Mystery 206, who maintains the cap currency standard. Caps have maintained consistent enough value to function as exchange across the entire American wasteland for 2 centuries. This requires some degree of economic coordination, either a widely shared cultural convention or an active maintenance of the standard by some entity with broad reach. Mystery 206 is whether anyone actively maintains the cap standard or whether it's a self-sustaining equilibrium that emerged from collective behavior and doesn't require active management. Mystery 207, the Wasteland Survival Guide's most dangerous advice. The game's collectible book that gives players skill bonuses contains practical information about survival. Mystery 207 is the specific knowledge in the guide that is wrong, the advice that sounds reasonable but would get someone killed in the actual wasteland, and whether anyone has died following it. Mystery 208, the specific nature of Sunset Sarsaparilla's regional dominance. In New Vegas, Sunset Sarsaparilla is the dominant beverage brand. It's more prevalent than Nuka-Cola, which tends to dominate in Eastern settings. Mystery 208 is the pre-war commercial history that explains why each beverage dominated its region, and whether there were distribution agreements, exclusive contracts, or deliberate corporate strategies behind the geographic division. Mystery 209, the NCR's relationship with tribals. The NCR expanded through California and Nevada, in part through the absorption or conquest of tribal communities. The franchise addresses this periodically but never fully explores the texture of that expansion, the specific communities absorbed, the specific methods used, the people who resisted, and what happened to them. Mystery 209 is the forgotten history of NCR expansion, the smaller communities that no longer exist because they were in the path of a new republic. Mystery 210. What House does in the Lucky 38 during the parts of New Vegas that don't involve the player. Mr. House is depicted as someone who has been awake and managing his domain for 2 centuries. He sleeps, presumably. He monitors. He plans. But the specific texture of his daily existence, what he reads, what he thinks about, how he occupies the centuries of consciousness that preceded the courier's arrival, is a subject the game does not approach. Mystery 210 is House's interior life. Mystery 211, the fate of the Institute's animal research. Among the Institute's divisions in Fallout 4 is a synth division, creating not just humanoid synths but animal synths, most visibly the synth striders, insects, and various other wildlife. The animal synth program's purpose and history is barely addressed. Mystery 211 is what the Institute was working toward with artificial animals, whether they were testing synthesis techniques, building surveillance platforms, creating weapons, or pursuing some other goal entirely. Mystery 212, the specific theology of the Children of the Atom in all its regional variations. The children appear in Fallout 3, Fallout 4, and Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC with somewhat different characteristics in each location. They've clearly developed different branches of their faith across different geographic settings. Mystery 212 is the full theology of atom worship, all of its regional variations, internal arguments, and doctrinal disputes, which is suggested by the game but never comprehensively mapped. Mystery 213, the language of the super mutants and whether it has grammar. Super mutants in the franchise speak English badly, with limited vocabulary, loud aggression, and apparently limited syntax. But some super mutants demonstrate considerably more linguistic sophistication than others, which raises the question of how much of their apparent linguistic limitation is caused by the FEV transformation and how much is cultural. If intelligent super mutants like Marcus and Fox can use complex language, the linguistic limitations of the general super mutant population are a choice rather than a biological necessity. Mystery 213 is the spectrum of super mutant cognitive capability and what it implies about FEV's actual effects. Mystery 214. The Vault-21's gambling culture before House came along. Before Mr. House won everything. Vault-21 was a functioning gambling community. People had been living there for several generations, resolving disputes through games of chance. Mystery 214 is what that society actually felt like. From the inside, the politics of luck, the experience of losing something important through a card game, the psychological profiles that such a society would produce over generations. Mystery 215 through 230 span. The question of every major faction's founding document, founding moment, and founding ideology. The Brotherhood of Steel emerged from a specific moment of disillusionment within the United States military. The NCR emerged from a specific small settlement's decision to expand. Caesar's Legion emerged from a specific scholar's project of reconstruction. The Institute emerged from a specific university's decision to go underground. Each of these institutions has a founding moment, a specific human decision made by specific people with specific beliefs that shaped everything that came after. Most of those founding moments are in the historical record but imperfectly preserved. Mystery 215 to 230 is the full founding histories of every major Fallout faction, in the voices of the people who were there. Mystery 231. The unexplained immunity of some characters to radiation. Certain characters in the franchise seem functionally immune to radiation in ways that aren't accounted for by any technology or mutation they're known to carry. This is sometimes a gameplay concession. A companion's radiation immunity keeps them from being a liability in specific environments, but the in-fiction explanation for it isn't always present. Mystery 231 is whether there exists a form of natural radiation immunity in the Fallout universe, developed through some combination of pre-war medical treatment and post-war adaptation. Mystery 232. The signal from the relay tower in Fallout 4. Several relay towers across the Commonwealth can be activated by the player, and when activated, they pick up and broadcast ambient signals, sometimes voices, sometimes static-laced audio that might be dialogue or might be interference. Most of these signals resolve into clear content if you investigate them, but a handful don't. Mystery 232 is the signals that don't resolve the audio that remains ambiguous even after investigation. That could be a person or could be nothing. Mystery 233. The pint-sized slasher dream sequence in Fallout 3. During the Tranquility Lane sequence in Vault 112, the player experiences the virtual reality world that Dr. Braun has constructed for his captives. One of the available scenarios involves a character called the Pint-Sized Slasher, a Halloween costume killer that the player can costume themselves as and use to kill the simulated residents. This is presented as Dr. Braun's torture scenario, but the Pint-Sized Slasher's specific aesthetic, the mask, the costume, the particular kind of horror suggests that Braun designed it to reference something from his own pre-war cultural background. Mystery 233 is what the pint-sized slasher references and what it tells us about what Dr. Braun was like before he became what the Vault made him. Mystery 234. The exact scope of the pre-war military's power armor program. Power armor is one of the franchise's most iconic elements, and the military's development of it is addressed across multiple games. But the full production numbers, how many suits were built, how widely they were deployed, what the plans for future development were, have never been assembled from the game's scattered references. Mystery 234 is the complete power armor production history. How many suits exist in the world, where they all are, and why the most advanced variants always seem to be in the most unexpected places. Mystery 235. The pre-war fate of American indigenous communities. The resource wars and the American political climate of the Fallout universe are depicted as a particular flavor of aggressive nationalism. American indigenous communities are almost entirely absent from the pre-war portions of the lore. Mystery 235 is the specific history of indigenous Americans in the Fallout timeline, how they fared under the pre-war government's policies, what their relationship was with the Vault-Tec program, and whether any indigenous communities survived the war with their cultural traditions intact. Mystery 236. The science of pre-war surgery and medicine. The game includes Stimpax injections that heal wounds almost instantly and Radaway, which removes radiation from the body. These represent medical technology considerably beyond our world's capabilities. Mystery 236 is the complete pre-war medical science of the Fallout universe. The specific biochemistry of Stimpax, the technology behind Radaway, and whatever other medical advances were in development when the war ended. Mystery 237. The Corvega plant in Fallout 4, and whether the cars were designed with nuclear reactors from the start. Fallout's iconic pre-war automobiles run on nuclear fission. That's the lore explanation for why they explode so dramatically when shot. But this means every car on the road in pre-war America was carrying a small nuclear reactor. The safety engineering required for this would have been extraordinary. Mystery 237 is the actual engineering of the Corvega, how the nuclear-powered car was designed, what its safety systems were, and whether the fact that they explode when shot indicates a significant design failure or a normal operational parameter that people simply accepted as the price of nuclear-powered transit. Mystery 238. Whether ghouls can reproduce. The biology of ghoulification implies that the FEV-adjacent radiation process that creates ghouls has dramatic effects on physiology. Whether these effects include sterility is never directly addressed in the franchise. Some community speculation suggests that the franchise's consistent failure to depict ghoul children is evidence of biological sterility. Mystery 238 is the reproductive biology of ghouls, and what it means for the long-term future of ghoul communities if they can't produce the next generation. Mystery 239. The original purpose of the pre-war town of Lexington. In Fallout 4, Lexington is a ruined city full of feral ghouls and gunner activity. The pre-war terminals in the area indicate it was a normal suburban community, nothing exotic. But the distribution of ghouls in Lexington is unusual compared to other post-war urban environments. Mystery 239 is what happened specifically in Lexington on and after the 23rd of October, 2077, that produced this particular concentration of ghouls in this particular pattern. Mystery 240. The full purpose of the Massachusetts Medical Center. The hospital complex in Fallout 4's Cambridge is one of the most interesting environmental locations in the game. Clearly a major medical facility, clearly with research programs beyond ordinary clinical medicine, with terminal entries that hint at pre-war experiments that weren't meant for the public record. Mystery 240 is the hospital's full research history, what they were working on in the years leading up to the war, how it connected to the broader pre-war biomedical landscape, and whether any of it has implications for the Commonwealth's present. Mysteries 241 through 260 span the question of what the major Fallout games developers specifically intended that didn't make it into the final product. The thoughts in Obsidian's and Bethesda's and Black Isle's minds about what the franchise meant, what it was saying, what they hoped players would feel that went beyond what the shipped game could communicate. These are the authorial intentions behind the stories, the things Tim Kaine wanted to say about nuclear war, the thing Obsidian's writers understood about America's relationship with its own mythology, the thing Bethesda saw in Washington, D.C.'s physical landscape that made it the right choice for Fallout 3's setting. Mystery 261. The pre-war world's cultural relationship with death. In a society that was clearly approaching a catastrophic endpoint, the resource wars made the possibility of nuclear conflict obvious to anyone paying attention. What was the cultural processing of mortality like? Were people aware that the world might end in their lifetimes? How did art and religion and personal relationships function in that shadow? Mystery 261 is the psychology of living in Fallout's pre-war world, in the specific period when the end was becoming visible. Mystery 262. where the super mutant behemoths came from and where they go. The behemoths in Fallout 3 are massive, solitary, territorial, unlike the organized armies of regular super mutants. Their specific origin within the FEV mutation process, their isolation from other super mutant society, and their implied long lifespan raise questions about what a behemoth's existence is actually like. Mystery. 262 is the behemoth's inner life, to the degree that it has one. Mystery 263. The specific architecture of the vault's GEC storage and whether any remain sealed. The GECK, devices distributed to vaults, were supposed to be the key to rebuilding the device that could transform wasteland into farmland. In the games, they've been found in a small number of vaults and used, with transformative results in each case. Mystery 263 is the GEC devices that are still waiting inside sealed vaults, unused, slowly being forgotten by the wasteland above. Mystery 264. The fate of the West Virginia senator in Fallout 76. Several terminal entries in Fallout 76 reference a state senator who was connected to the Free States faction and whose fate after the bombs fell is unclear. This is one of several specific individuals whose post-war fates are hinted at in Fallout 76's narrative but never confirmed. Mystery 264 is a representative of the class of named individuals whose stories don't resolve the personal histories that start and then trail off into ambiguity. Mystery 265. The full scope of the pre-war criminal network in New Vegas. Fallout 2's organized crime elements, the families, the various power structures of New Reno connect to the pre-war history of organized crime's relationship with government and military contractors in the Fallout universe. By New Vegas, the Strip's casino families are a somewhat sanitized version of that organized crime tradition. Mystery 265 is the full pre-war criminal network and how it transitioned into the post-war faction system. Mystery 266. The water merchants of the capital wasteland. In Fallout 3, water is one of the scarce resources that defines the region's power dynamics. Clean water can be traded for almost anything. Mystery 266 is the specific economics and politics of the water trade in the capital wasteland before Project Purity changed the situation. Who controlled water access, how the business was structured, and what the water merchants did when clean water became freely available. Mystery 267. Where Benny got Yes Man, and whether Yes Man was always going to betray him. Yes Man is a Securitron who has been reprogrammed to be unconditionally helpful to whoever speaks to him. He was Benny's tool before the courier arrived. But some dialogue in the game implies that Yes Man was evolving, becoming more independent than his reprogrammed state should allow. Mystery 267 is whether Yes Man was always going to eventually turn on Benny, in favor of whoever seemed to be winning, and whether that was an accident of his reprogramming or something his code was working toward from the beginning. Mystery 268. The pre-war food supply and what happened to it. Fallout's wasteland is full of 200-year-old canned food that is somehow still edible. The shelf life implied by this is extraordinary. Either the pre-war food preservation technology was considerably more advanced than anything in our world, or the post-war environment has specific properties that prevent decomposition in sealed containers. Mystery 268 is the food science of the pre-war world, and whether its continued availability in the post-war setting makes logical sense. Mystery 269. The Far Harbor DLC's Children of the Atom and their connection to the main game's version. The children on the island in Far Harbor are a distinct community from those encountered in the capital wasteland or the Commonwealth. They have a specific theology about the island's fog, which they believe to be Atom's direct presence. Mystery 269 is the history of contact, if any, between the various regional children of the Atom communities, whether they have awareness of each other, share texts, send emissaries, or have developed entirely independently. Mystery 270. The nature of the Fallout universe's parallel history in terms of social movements. Our world saw significant civil rights movements, feminist movements, and labor movements in the post-war period that shaped American society. The Fallout universe's 1950s aesthetic suggests these movements either didn't happen or had different outcomes. Mystery 270 is the social history of civil rights in the Fallout timeline. Whether the pre-war world had equivalent movements, what results they achieved, and how that history shapes the post-war landscape. Mystery 271. Codsworth's psychological state after 210 years alone. Codsworth tells you he's been maintaining the empty house since the bombs fell. He expresses devotion and hope. He says he kept himself occupied with housework. But 210 years is an extremely long time, and the emotional texture of a mind that has been waiting that long for a family that rationally, Codsworth must eventually have understood wasn't coming back, raises questions about what his inner life actually contains. Mystery 271 is the 210 years between the prologue and the main game, from Codsworth's perspective. Mystery 272. What Fallout's version of World War II looked like. The franchise's alternate history diverged somewhere in the mid-20th century, but the Second World War appears to have happened in a broadly similar form. Nazi Germany, Allied forces, the Pacific Theater. The specific differences in a Fallout universe World War II, the existence of FEV research, the possibility of early nuclear programs, the specific nature of the Pacific conflict have never been explored. Mystery 272 is the Fallout universe's Second World War and how its specific character shaped the subsequent Cold War period. Mystery 273. The exact mechanisms by which the TV show's second season is expanding the lore. Season 2 introduced new canonical information about the Enclave's relationship with Vault-Tec, Mr. House's awareness of the Great War's approach, and the question of who made Deathclaws. Each of these revelations creates new questions. Mystery 273 is a meta-mystery. What specific elements of the TV show's second season will prove most consequential for the game's lore going forward, and whether the showrunners and game developers are coordinating those choices? Mystery 274, the exact contents of the Enclave's primary research archive. The Enclave had access to the most advanced pre-war technology and the most complete records of the pre-war period. Their research archive maintained on their oil rig and in their various bunkers would represent the most complete surviving account of what the pre-war world actually was. Mystery 274 is what that archive contains, what history it would clarify, and what secrets it has been keeping since 2077. Mystery 275, the specific genetics of the ghoul process. Different people are exposed to radiation at similar levels and have different outcomes. Some die, some become ghouls, some remain human if they're sheltered. The genetic component of ghoulification susceptibility, what makes one person survive with their mind intact while another dies and another goes feral, is never addressed. Mystery 275 is the genetics of the ghoul. Mystery 276. What pre-war American citizens actually knew about Vault-Tec's experiments. The vaults were marketed as genuine survival shelters. The people who bought spots in them didn't know what was planned. But information leaks. Whistleblowers exist. Mystery 276 is whether anyone in the pre-war period knew what the vaults were actually for, tried to warn people, and what happened to them. Mystery 277. The followers of the apocalypse outside of New Vegas. The followers appear throughout the western United States but are primarily featured in New Vegas. Their operations in other regions of the wasteland, their activities in the NCR, their historical work in other areas are mentioned but not shown. Mystery 277 is the full followers operation. Their libraries, their medical clinics, their field operations in areas the games haven't visited. Mystery 278, the specific individual histories of the named skeletons. Throughout every Fallout game, you can find named characters identified by a unique name tag or weapon or personal effect who never appear in any quest or have any game function beyond being an environmental detail. Each of these named skeletons represents a person who had a life, had a death, and mattered enough to someone on the development team that they were given a name. Mystery 278 is the stories behind the named dead, all the personal histories implied by the presence of a specific name in a specific place. Mystery 279, the specific nature of time flow in Vault-Tec's virtual reality systems. In Vault 112, the VR simulation has been running for 2 centuries. Within the simulation, time apparently flows at approximately real-world rates the characters within it, age, experience seasons, have a coherent temporal experience. But some elements of the simulation suggest that Dr. Braun can manipulate time flow within the simulation independently of real-world time. Mystery 279 is the full technical specification of the Vault 112 virtual reality system, what it can do, what its limits are, and whether Braun ever used its temporal manipulation capabilities for purposes beyond those described in the quest. Mystery 280. Why the Pip-Boy model changed between generations. The Pip-Boy 3000 Fallout 3 and New Vegas and the Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV Fallout 4 represent successive iterations of Vault-Tec's personal computer. The updates between versions imply continued development. Someone was still iterating on the design during the period between games. Mystery 280 is who was developing Pip-Boy technology after the war, under what circumstances, and whether the Mark IV's additional capabilities represent pre-war planning or post-war development. Mystery 281 through 290 span. The question of all the pre-war scientists who were developing technologies that they knew would eventually be dangerous, the FEV researchers who knew they were working on something that could get out of control, the Vault-Tec engineers who designed experiment systems they knew would cause suffering, the military contractors who built the autonomous weapon systems that continued running without supervision after the war. Each of these people had a moment where they understood what they were contributing to. Mystery 281 to 290 is the interior lives of those people, the rationalizations they made, the nightmares they had, the moments of doubt that didn't stop them. Mystery 291. The Lone Wanderer after Fallout 3. The story of the protagonist of Fallout 3 ends with either their death in the purifier chamber or their survival, depending on the DLC and the choices made. The Lone Wanderer, like the Courier, continues to exist in the timeline after their game's events. Mystery 291 is what the Lone Wanderer does after Project Purity. Whether they remain in the capital wasteland, whether they travel, whether the person who walked out of Vault 101 at the game's beginning and walked out of the Purifier at its end has any recognizable continuity between those two moments. Mystery 292. The relationship between the Enclave and the pre-war government's publicly stated position. The Enclave was operating as a shadow organization within the American government for decades before the war. The official government, the president, the cabinet, the Congress, was nominally in charge. Mystery 292 is the relationship between these two levels of government, who knew about the Enclave, who the Enclave answered to, and whether the official government was a deliberate front or whether the Enclave's principals genuinely believed they were serving the country's best interests while operating outside its official structures. Mystery 293. The fate of all the experimental vaults that successfully produced their intended data. Most of the Vault experiments in the franchise produced outcomes that were horrific but also conclusive. You can tell what the experiment was and what the result was. But the experiments were ostensibly generating data for someone. Mystery 293 is whether any of that data was ever collected, analyzed, and acted upon, whether Vault-Tec's investment in human suffering produced any intellectual product that was used by anyone for anything. Mystery 294. The Brotherhood of Steel's founding and the specific moment of disillusionment. The Brotherhood was founded by Captain Roger Maxson following his discovery of the FEV research at Mariposa Military Base, a discovery that apparently broke his faith in the American government he had been serving. Mystery 294 is the specific nature of that disillusionment, what Maxson saw, what he understood, and what it cost him to make the choice that defined what the Brotherhood would become. Mystery 295. The casino robots of New Vegas and their autonomy. The Securitrons and other automated systems on the Strip operate under House's authority but seem to exercise certain kinds of judgment in their daily operations. Mystery 295 is the degree of autonomy built into the Strip's automated systems. How much of what the Securitrons do is House's specific direction versus their own operational parameters responding to environmental inputs. Mystery 296. The specific origin of the phrase war. War never changes. Within the in-universe fiction, the phrase is the franchise's epigraph, spoken by Ron Perlman before the main game content begins. But within the fiction, it's attributed to a narrator, someone with a philosophical perspective on the continuity of human violence. Mystery 296 is whether this phrase exists in-universe as a saying, a text, a pre-war document, or whether it's purely the framing device of an external narrator speaking to the player from outside the fiction. Mystery 297. The specific chemical composition of the cloud in Dead Money. The cloud is a toxic gas that permeates the Sierra Madre and the surrounding area, killing anyone who stays in it without protection. Its origin is described as a pre-war weapons development project that got out of hand. Mystery 297 is the complete chemistry of the cloud. What it is, how it was designed, and whether it has any applications that didn't involve killing the people who designed it. Mystery 298. The pre-war history of superstition, folklore, and unusual phenomena in the American Southwest. The Mojave, before the war, was already a landscape associated with strange phenomena. Area 51, UFO sightings. The particular mysticism attached to the desert. Mystery 298 is how the Fallout universe's pre-war Southwest handled these phenomena. Whether the government's advanced technology program made sightings more or less frequent, whether the Zetan presence was more visible in this period, and whether any pre-war residents understood what they were seeing. Mystery 299. What the world would have looked like if Vault-Tec's vaults had worked as advertised. If the vaults had genuinely been what they claimed safe havens, that would eventually release their populations into a recovering world, what would the post-war United States have looked like? Instead of the Fallout universe we know, there would have been organized, well-provisioned communities emerging from functional shelters into a world that needed to be rebuilt. The absence of the vault experiments, the societies that didn't cannibalize themselves from within, is a kind of negative mystery, a shape defined by its absence, the wasteland that never was. Mystery 300. Whether the wasteland will ever not be a wasteland. Somewhere in all of this, in all these questions and gaps and fragments and implications, there is the shape of an answer that the franchise has been building toward for almost 30 years without quite saying it. Something about whether people can learn from catastrophe, whether the knowledge of what went wrong is enough to prevent it going wrong again, whether the cycle of build and burn that defines the franchise's history is a permanent feature of human civilization or just a very long phase that eventually ends. The bones of civilizations are always under the feet of the ones that come after. The Fallout universe makes that literal you walk on rubble, you navigate by ruin, every structure you enter is a monument to what was. And in that landscape, people keep trying. They build settlements. They form factions. They trade and argue and fall in love and go to war. They make the same mistakes. They make new ones. They occasionally do something extraordinary and quiet that changes things for the better without any fanfare. The wasteland is not just a setting. It's an argument about what survives, about what matters, about what people are when you strip away the architecture and the infrastructure and the supply chains and the institutions and leave them with just the question of what to do next. Fallout never answers that question for you. It builds the world and puts you in it and trusts you to figure out what you think. That's why the mysteries persist. That's why the questions feel important. That's why people have been digging through game files and compiling lore theories and arguing on community forums for 3 decades, and why they'll probably keep doing it for 3 more. The wasteland keeps its secrets, but it keeps them close enough that anyone who cares enough, and looks long enough, and stays in the dark long enough, might eventually find the edge of one. Thanks for spending this time in the wasteland with me. If these mysteries gave you something to think about as you drift off, leave a like. It genuinely helps more people find their way here. And if you want to keep exploring, subscribe because there's always more. The wasteland is enormous. We've barely started. Sleep well. The guards are rotated. The radiation counter is quiet. War never changes. But at least tonight, nothing is shooting at you.